The moon has always been there, silent, steady, and eternal. Hanging in the darkness of our skies, it has guided tides, marked calendars, and been a witness to every rise and fall of human civilization. To the ancients, it was a god. To poets, it was a muse. To lovers, it was a mirror of longing. And yet, for all its familiarity, the moon has remained the great unknown, a place that promised silence so profound it could never be broken. But what if that silence was not as absolute as we once believed? What if, at least once in history, the moon did not keep its silence, but spoke? It is a strange idea, one that unsettles even as it fascinates. After all, the moon is supposed to be mute, a barren rock, lifeless and voiceless. And yet, hidden in the archives of history, whispered among researchers and murmured in the dim corners of late-night conversations, is a claim too peculiar to dismiss outright. During the Apollo missions, NASA recorded something unexpected, not static, not radio distortion, something structured, something rhythmic, something that sounded less like the cold mathematics of machines and more like a voice. If such a recording exists, why was it never revealed to the public? Why, in a world so hungry for wonder, would NASA, the agency that showed humanity its first steps on another world, choose silence over revelation? Perhaps the answer lies not in what the recording contained, but in what it suggested, that the moon is not what we think it is, and that the universe is not as empty as we once believed. To begin such a journey, we must understand not only the facts but also the feelings that surrounded those years. The 1960s were a time of urgency, of fear, of impossible ambition. The Cold War had stretched a thin, brittle tension across the globe. Every scientific discovery, every technological achievement was sharpened into a weapon of prestige and power. When John F. Kennedy promised that America would land a man on the moon before the decade was out, it was not just a dream, it was a race against time, against rivals, against the vastness of space itself. In those nights, the world looked up at the sky not with casual familiarity, but with trembling expectation. The moon, that pale companion that had watched over humanity since the beginning, was suddenly not just a symbol. It was a target, a destination, a place where history would be written in dust. Yet as humanity prepared to walk upon it, there was an unspoken question buried beneath the technical manuals and televised speeches. What waits for us there? Most expected nothing but rocks, craters, and silence. But as the rockets lifted, as voices crackled across headsets, and as boots finally pressed into that fine lunar dust, something unexpected seemed to follow. Strange gaps in transmissions. Moments of unexplained static, hushed conversations between astronauts that never appeared in the official transcripts, and eventually the whisper of something more, a tape tucked away in the archives, holding a sound that should not exist. Imagine for a moment what such a sound would mean. If the moon truly spoke, was it an echo of natural forces beyond our comprehension, the vibration of a hollow world resonating like a bell? Or was it something altogether stranger, something conscious? These questions linger, impossible to dismiss once heard. Because even if the recording is never played, even if the tape is lost or locked away, the idea alone changes the way we look at that familiar silver disk in the night sky. The purpose of this story is not to prove or disprove what was heard. Instead, it is to trace the echoes, the way this mystery weaves itself into science, into conspiracy, into myth, and into the human imagination. For the truth, if it ever existed, has already become more than fact. It has become a story, a shadow, a haunting possibility that reminds us how fragile our definitions of silence truly are. And so, we begin here, in the quiet. A quiet that feels eternal but is already breaking. A quiet that seems safe but hides the faintest hum beneath it. We stand at the edge of one of history's most carefully guarded rumors. The claim that the moon is not silent. That something, once, long ago, spoke from its shadowed surface. In this documentary, we will move slowly, as though drifting through space itself. Each chapter will unfold like a crater revealed in the slow sweep of lunar dawn. We will listen to the astronauts who hinted at more than they could say, We will open the vaults of NASA's forgotten tapes. We will follow the whispers of archivists, scientists, and storytellers. We will balance on the thin line between science and imagination, fact and folklore. And we will ask again and again the question that hums beneath it all. What if the silence was never silent? The journey will not be comfortable. Mystery rarely is. Some will say it was all illusion, technical interference, psychological stress, or misinterpretation. Others will whisper of Cold War secrets, cover-ups too delicate to expose. And a few, those who have stared longest into the shadows, will insist that the moon spoke because it has always spoken, and that we were simply foolish enough to finally listen. Wherever the truth lies, we know one thing. The moon has always been a mirror. It reflects not only the light of the sun, but also the dreams and fears of the people who stare up at it. To some, it is a promise of hope. To others, a reminder of loneliness. Perhaps the recording, real or imagined, was not the moon speaking at all, but humanity hearing its own voice projected into the void, a cosmic echo of our longing to know we are not alone. And so, we stand here at the threshold of silence and sound, ready to step into the story. The moon waits above us, the same as it always has been, and yet forever changed by a rumor that refuses to die. Whether truth or fiction, secret or myth, the story of the forgotten recording has become part of its shadow, part of its mystery, part of us. To understand it fully, we must begin not with the recording itself, but with the night when silence was first broken. A night when the world held its breath, when eyes turned upward, and when humanity listened, not just with its instruments, but with its imagination. Because before the moon ever spoke, there was a time when the earth itself fell silent, waiting for the first answer. The story of the moon is as old as humanity itself, but the story of the night the world truly looked up begins in the middle of the 20th century. To understand the mystery whispered in the shadows of Apollo, we must step first into a world defined not by wonder, but by fear. The 1960s were an age of division, tension, and impossible ambition. Across continents, nations measured themselves not in poetry or philosophy, but in missiles, in satellites. In the distance, their machines could climb into the void. The Cold War was not only a rivalry of ideology, it was a struggle of imagination, of who could claim ownership of the sky. For millennia, the moon had been only a symbol. Ancient priests charted its phases, seeing in its waxing and waning the rhythm of life itself. Farmers planted crops by its light, lovers whispered beneath. Its glow, poets traced its face in ink and song. It was untouchable, unreachable, the one constant in the turning of the earth. Yet by the mid-20th century, this timeless companion was no longer distant. It had become a target, a prize of national prestige. Humanity's oldest muse was suddenly transformed into a battlefield of symbols, one that promised no blood but demanded everything else: money, genius, and human lives cast upward in fire. It began, as so many stories of that age did, with fear. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1 in 1957, the world changed overnight. A sphere no larger than a beach ball, beeping softly as it circled the globe, became the most terrifying sound of its time. For those who listened on shortwave radios, the signal was little more than a chirp. Yet behind that chirp echoed the possibility of warheads arcing silently across the sky. For Americans, it was a revelation. The heavens were no longer theirs to dream about in peace. They were a theater of conflict. In response, the United States poured staggering resources into catching up. NASA was born in 1958, a child of urgency rather than wonder. Rockets thundered from Florida's swamps, experimental capsules plunged into oceans, and one after another, young test pilots risked their lives to push further into the dark. Space was no longer a myth, it was an arena. And at the center of that arena, like a silver crown hung above the battlefield, glowed the moon. Whoever could plant their flag upon it would not only claim victory in the space race, but prove their system, democracy or communism, was destined to master the future. As years passed, the moon transformed in the human imagination. It ceased to be only a symbol of mystery and longing. It became a countdown. Each headline, each broadcast, measured the distance shrinking between Earth and its companion. And yet, through all this urgency, there remained a paradox. The closer we came to reaching it, the more alien it seemed. Photographs captured by telescopes and probes revealed a surface of desolate beauty. Craters upon craters, landscapes untouched by wind or rain for billions of years. A place that promised silence deeper than anything found on Earth. It was, in a way, terrifying. Imagine the mindset of a child in 1961, watching black and white television, as President John F. Kennedy declared that America would send a man to the moon before the decade was out. The words were soaring, defiant, but beneath them was something else, a quiet recognition that the impossible was being promised in public. Adults exchanged glances. Scientists sweated over calculations. Engineers cursed at engines that exploded, more often than they worked, and yet the dream was planted and with it a shared gaze. For the first time in history, nearly every human being alive looked up at the same object with the same question: when will we arrive? The moon became a mirror not only of human ambition, but of human fear. For the Soviets, the challenge was to maintain their lead. For the Americans, it was to overcome humiliation. For the astronauts, it was to step into an unknown that no myth could truly prepare them for. And for the public, it was to watch the heavens change from eternal mystery to reachable destination. Late at night, radios hummed with broadcasts of test flights and orbital missions. Newspapers printed diagrams of spacecraft alongside stories of global tension. Families stood outside, pointing at the night sky, imagining men in capsules already circling overhead. But the moon was also more than politics. Beneath the rivalry, beneath the fear, there was awe. Humanity had lived for thousands of years in the shadow of this silent neighbor, and suddenly we were on the cusp of crossing the void. Artists painted visions of lunar colonies. Writers dreamed of futures where children would grow up on its surface. Scientists spoke with trembling voices of experiments that might reveal the origins of the solar system. The moon had always been there, but now it was alive again, not just in myth, but in possibility. And yet possibility often comes wrapped in dread. For all the optimism of Kennedy's promise, there lingered darker whispers. What if the moon held dangers no one could predict? What if astronauts found more than dust and rock? Science dismissed such thoughts, but folklore has a way of lingering in the shadows of logic. Ancient cultures had always told stories of the moon as a place of spirits, of voices, of gods who spoke from above. Even in the age of rockets, those stories lay dormant, waiting for the right moment to awaken. In living rooms and classrooms, children stared at globes of the moon, their smooth plastic craters standing in for places that had never been touched. They dreamed not only of heroes planting flags, but of the silence itself. What would it sound like? Could silence even be heard? These were questions left unspoken, but they stirred in the imagination. Because the moon was not just a scientific goal, it was a symbol of the unknown, and the unknown, by its very nature, carries fear. By the mid-1960s, the race was in full stride. Cosmonauts orbited, astronauts followed, and the rockets grew taller, their engines fiercer. Television brought every triumph and disaster into homes across the world. People saw fire on the launch pads, capsules sinking in the sea, men risking everything in fragile machines thinner than aluminum foil. And with each step, the moon loomed closer. The night sky no longer belonged only to poets and dreamers. It belonged to engineers, to generals, to the collective will of nations determined to claim the unreachable. Yet even as the technology advanced, the mythic image of the moon persisted. It was the place where silence lived, where nothing moved, where no sound could travel. It was eternal stillness. And perhaps that was why the rumor of a recording would one day strike so deeply, because if the moon could speak even once, it would shatter not only science, but myth itself. As 1969 approached, the world held its breath. The Apollo program had grown into a vast machine of industry and willpower, employing hundreds of thousands, consuming billions of dollars. Newspapers chronicled every failure and every success. At night, when people walked outside and looked up, They no longer saw just the moon. They saw a destination, a prize, and whether they admitted it or not, a question. A question that grew sharper with each successful launch. What will we truly find there? The astronauts themselves were careful with their words, but in candid moments they admitted what everyone felt: unease. The moon was no simple rock. It was vast, strange, and haunting. Its silence pressed on them even from afar. To step onto it would be to enter another world entirely, one that had waited untouched for longer than humanity had existed. And perhaps in that silence something waited. This was the world's state of mind when Apollo 11 prepared to launch. A world tense with rivalry, alive with awe, trembling with the weight of the impossible. A world united, if only for a moment, by eyes turned upward. For on that night, when the rockets roared and the capsule rose, humanity collectively looked past its borders, its fears, its wars, and stared into the dark sky, into the light of the moon. That night was not only a triumph of engineering, it was a transformation of imagination. The moon was no longer distant, no longer mute. It was a place that could be touched, explored, even lived upon. Yet, as history proves, silence is rarely what it seems, and the moon's silence, above all, would not remain unbroken. Silence was supposed to be the defining feature of space. The vacuum, after all, carries no sound, no rustling wind, no rolling thunder, not even the faintest whisper of air. For the astronauts who dared to leave Earth, the only voices they expected to hear were those carried by radio, steady transmissions from mission control, or the chatter of their crewmates sealed in the same fragile capsule. Beyond that, there should have been nothing, nothing at all. And yet, from the very beginning of the Apollo missions, there were disturbances, strange interruptions, moments when silence cracked and static surged in places it should not have been. Engineers could explain away some of it: interference from solar activity, the bending of signals as they passed through Earth's ionosphere, or even flaws in the primitive equipment of the 1960s. But others resisted easy answers. The first anomalies appeared not as dramatic revelations, but as subtle gaps. A few seconds here, a minute there, where communication between the spacecraft and Earth simply cut out. On paper it was trivial. Spacecraft were complex machines, vulnerable to countless small failures. But what unsettled those who listened closely was the frequency of these gaps, and the fact that, more than once, they seemed to occur at oddly specific moments, right when an astronaut began to describe something unusual. Transcripts from Apollo missions show occasional notes: unexplained noise on channel, signal dropout, recording redacted. The public, watching televised highlights, never noticed. For them, the story was seamless, an unbroken arc of heroism, from liftoff to splashdown. But behind the curtain, technicians whispered of interruptions that did not always behave like mere glitches, static that carried rhythm, interference that seemed almost deliberate. There were also rumors, hushed, unofficial, about exchanges between astronauts and mission control that never made it into the official record. Astronauts speaking quickly, voices clipped with urgency, only to be drowned by sudden bursts of static. When the sound cleared, the subject was dropped. The conversation moved on. Later, transcripts were scrubbed, edited into clean narratives of technical checklists and calm professionalism. Yet, those who had heard the raw feeds claimed something was missing. One technician, years later, described a moment during Apollo 11's journey when the feed cut to static, just as an astronaut began describing objects on the horizon. The official record showed nothing unusual, only a routine check of instruments. But those who remembered the raw moment swore the astronaut's tone was different, charged with something unsaid. Then came the hiss, long and unbroken, before the channel returned. To the outside world, such claims were dismissed as misremembered details or worse, conspiracy. But within NASA's walls, the issue of unexplained static was very real. Engineers pored over signal paths, searching for errors. They tested transmitters, checked antennae, adjusted receivers. Yet the disturbances continued, often in places where they could not be predicted. By the time of Apollo 10, the mission that circled the moon in preparation for Apollo 11, stories began to circulate of something stranger still. astronauts reported weird music in their headsets as they passed over the far side of the moon, cut off from direct contact with Earth. The official explanation was interference between VHF radios. It was plausible, technical, neat. But for those who heard the recordings later, the sound did not resemble random static. It rose and fell, carrying an odd pattern, as though it belonged to a song too faint to name. The idea unsettled even the astronauts themselves. They joked about it on tape, but beneath the laughter was unease. What exactly had they heard there, in the shadow of the moon? No one expected silence to sing. The more missions flew, the more whispers spread. Some claimed NASA deliberately withheld portions of the tapes from public release, citing national security or irrelevant content. Others pointed out the occasional discrepancies between raw mission logs and the polished transcripts given to the press. A line removed here, a pause omitted there, always subtle, always just enough to raise questions. For the public, none of this was visible. They watched their televisions, listened to the calm voices of astronauts describing experiments, and marveled at the sight of men walking on another world. But for those who worked in the shadows of the communications network, technicians in tracking stations, archivists in storage rooms, analysts with access to raw feeds, the story was different. They had heard things they could not explain, and sometimes they swore, things they were told never to repeat. Static, after all, can be convenient. It covers gaps. It swallows words. It can be blamed on faulty equipment, on distance, on solar flares. But static can also be something more. A veil, a curtain behind which something waits. The more technicians described it, the less it sounded like randomness. Some bursts came with structure, rising pitches, rhythmic pulses, strange harmonics that seemed to echo in ways no ordinary interference should. Were these artifacts of machines pushed beyond their limits, or were they fragments of something else slipping through channels never meant to carry them? One story told by a former contractor described how, during a late-night shift, he replayed a section of tape marked as static. Expecting only noise, he leaned back casually in his chair. But what he heard instead made him sit upright. The hiss rose and fell, not chaotically but almost like breathing. For a moment, just a moment, he thought he could make out syllables buried within it. The sound chilled him, and when he mentioned it to his supervisor the next day, he was told firmly to leave it alone. The tape was logged, filed, and forgotten, or so he assumed. Such anecdotes are easy to dismiss. Human memory is fragile. Static is, by nature, random. In a hiss of white noise, the brain can imagine patterns, words, even voices. Psychologists call it auditory pareidolia, the same phenomenon that lets us hear ghostly whispers in wind or music in the hum of machinery. Perhaps the moon had not spoken at all. Perhaps it was only the human mind, desperate to make sense of emptiness, that turned static into song. And yet, doubts remain. Because if it were truly only imagination, why were tapes redacted? Why were conversations cut short? Why were gaps explained with reasons that satisfied no one fully? For years, such questions drifted quietly, overshadowed by the glory of the landings. The world wanted heroes, not mysteries. They wanted clean narratives, not static. The astronauts themselves rarely spoke of anomalies. Bound by duty, by pride, and sometimes by confidentiality, they kept their words measured. To admit they had heard something inexplicable would be to invite doubt, not only about themselves, but about the mission itself. Still, in rare moments, fragments surfaced, an astronaut hinting in an interview about strange noises, a technician describing music on the far side of the moon, a researcher noting that official transcripts were curiously tidy compared to raw logs. Each piece alone could be dismissed. Together they painted a pattern, and patterns once seen are difficult to ignore. For those who sought the truth, the static became more than noise. It became a symbol, a sign of something just beyond. Reach. Perhaps it was only the limits of technology. Perhaps it was human error. But perhaps in the spaces between signal and silence, something else was trying to be heard. Something that did not belong to Earth, but to the shadowed face of the moon. By the end of the Apollo era, the static was almost forgotten, buried beneath achievements and headlines. But in the corners of archives, in the memories of those who listened too closely, it lingered. A reminder that the story of Apollo was not only about triumphs and footprints, it was also about questions. Questions hidden in hisses, in missing minutes, in fragments of sound that slipped through the void. Because silence, as the world was beginning to realize, is rarely absolute. It deceives, it hides, it transforms. And in the static of Apollo's transmissions, silence may have broken in ways we still do not understand, but one anomaly, one sound, would echo louder than all the rest. There are moments in history that become legends, not because of what they reveal, but because of what they almost reveal. Apollo 10 is one such moment. Officially, it was a rehearsal, the dress rehearsal for Apollo 11. Every maneuver was performed, every orbit completed, every checklist ticked off. The only thing the crew did not do was land. They descended close, skimming above the lunar surface at just 9 miles altitude, then turned back, leaving the first footprints to their successors. But Apollo 10 left behind something stranger than footprints. It left behind a whisper. For decades, the mission seemed uncontroversial. The public saw it as routine, a necessary step toward history. Yet buried in the mission transcripts, there was an exchange so odd that it would not surface widely until the late 2000s, when NASA released declassified archives of Apollo recordings. What people discovered inside those tapes sent shivers through imaginations worldwide. The astronauts, Thomas Stafford, John Young, and Eugene Cernan, had reported something unusual as they passed around the far side of the moon. In that lonely arc, cut off from all contact with Earth, they found themselves hearing music. The term they used was casual, almost offhanded. Music. But the words themselves, spoken in the closed cabin of a spacecraft drifting in lunar orbit, carried weight, because there should have been no sound at all. In the official recordings, the voices of the astronauts are clipped, almost disbelieving. "Boy, that sure is weird music," one remarks. Another agrees, describing the sound as outer space-type music. There is nervous laughter. Their tone teeters between joking and unsettled, as though they are trying to normalize the inexplicable by wrapping it in humor. Yet beneath the surface you can hear it, the edge in their voices. For nearly an hour, as the spacecraft traced its path around the moon's hidden side, they reported the same strange phenomenon. The sound was not random static, not the ordinary hiss of interference. It had tone, rhythm, something almost melodic. When the tapes became public decades later, NASA offered an explanation. The sound, they said, was simply radio interference. Apollo 10's lunar and command modules both used VHF radios. When signals crossed, they could create feedback, harmonics, and strange oscillations. To engineers, this was all that was needed, to demystify the so-called music. And yet the explanation did not entirely convince those who listened. Because if it were merely interference, why did the astronauts themselves react as though it were something utterly new? Why describe it not as static or feedback, but as music? This is where interpretation diverges. For the technical-minded, Apollo 10's whispers are an open and shut case. Spacecraft electronics in the 1960s were temperamental. The systems were complicated, overlapping, prone to bleed through. In an environment as extreme as lunar orbit, unusual sounds were expected. To call it music was simply a matter of human psychology, the brain imposing familiar categories onto unfamiliar noise. But for others, the mystery lies not in the sound itself, but in the reaction. The crew did not dismiss it as a glitch. They discussed it, they questioned it, and they did so in a place where they knew no one on Earth could hear them, not until the tapes were reviewed. That vulnerability, that privacy, makes their astonishment feel more authentic. And so conspiratorial interpretations emerged. Some claimed the music was a signal, something generated not by human machines, but by something else hidden on the far side of the moon. After all, it was the one place utterly shielded from Earth's transmissions. In that shadowed region, cut off from all human contact, could there have been something broadcasting? Something the astronauts stumbled across by accident? Others pointed out the choice of words. Music. Music implies structure, repetition, something. Designed rather than accidental. Could it have been a beacon? A message? even an echo of something ancient resonating from beneath the lunar crust. Theories multiplied. Some whispered of alien bases hidden beyond the craters. Others speculated about natural resonances within the moon itself, vibrations that could, under the right conditions, produce tonal sounds. Still others suggested that NASA knew more than it admitted, that the tapes had been suppressed for decades, not because they were mundane, but because they hinted at the unexplainable. What lends weight to these theories is not only the astronauts' words, but the atmosphere of secrecy around them. For years, the recordings remained locked away, only available to select researchers. It was not until the early 21st century that the public gained access, and by then, the Apollo program was already legend wrapped in nostalgia and myth. The music, when finally revealed, became part of that mythology. Imagine the scene: 3 men drifting above the moon's far side, surrounded by darkness, no radio contact with Earth, no voice from Houston in their ears, only the hiss of oxygen, the creak of machinery, and then tones, rising, falling, eerie in their persistence. Tones that none of them expected, tones that none of them could explain in the moment. It is in such moments that fear becomes tangible, not the fear of equipment failure or hostile environments. Those are known risks, measured, prepared for. But fear of the unknown, fear of hearing something that should not exist, in a place where nothing is supposed to make sound at all. The astronauts did not dwell on it. Professionals to the core, they moved on with their tasks, checked instruments, adjusted their orbit. But their brief exchange remained, captured forever on tape, waiting decades for the world to notice. When the recordings surfaced, they split audiences into 2 camps. Some listened and shrugged, curious, yes, but clearly interference. Others listened and shivered, convinced they were hearing something the human ear was never meant to encounter. And in the middle sat the uncomfortable truth: we will never know exactly what those men heard in their headsets. For even if the raw audio was preserved, no recording can replicate the psychological weight of the moment. Context is everything. To hear it in the comfort of one's home is not the same as hearing it while orbiting a barren world, cut off from every human voice, surrounded only by the void. Still, the incident refuses to fade. It has become a touchstone for all who believe the moon holds secrets yet unrevealed. The music is cited in documentaries, whispered about in forums, spun into elaborate tales of hidden civilizations or alien broadcasts. For skeptics, it is a reminder of human imagination's tendency to fill silence with meaning. For believers, it is proof, fragile, elusive, but proof nonetheless, that the moon is not as empty as it seems. What cannot be denied is that Apollo 10 changed the narrative. Before it, anomalies were whispers among technicians, static buried in transmissions. After it, there was something undeniable in the official record, an exchange preserved in the voices of astronauts themselves. For the first time, the strangeness of space was not rumor, but documentation. And that documentation carried a weight NASA could not entirely shake. Because if Apollo 10 carried music, what would Apollo 11 carry? The world was already watching, with hungry eyes ready for humanity's first steps on alien soil. But now, for those who had listened to the whispers beyond the crater, there was another anticipation, not just of footprints and flags, but of what might be heard in the silence of the moon's surface. Would the music return? Would the static deepen into words? Would something hidden at the far side reveal itself under the gaze of cameras and microphones? The astronauts of Apollo 11 would go down in history as pioneers, as legends, as heroes. But they also carried with them the burden of expectation, not only to land, but perhaps to listen. And though the world would remember the sight of a man stepping onto lunar soil, for those who knew, the question lingered. Would they hear something impossible? Every mystery has its keystone, an object, a fragment, a single piece of evidence said to hold the truth. For the story of sounds on the moon, that keystone is a tape, not the ordinary reels of mission chatter released to the public, not the cleaned-up broadcasts played on television, but a different tape. A tape whispered about in the corridors of aerospace history, said to have been locked away deep within NASA's archives. To speak of it is to speak of rumor, but rumors have their own gravity. They pull at us, draw us closer, demand investigation. And this one begins in the years after Apollo, when the program was both triumph and ghost, proudly remembered, quietly shelved. In those years, whispers circulated among contractors, technicians, and archivists that a recording existed of an event never broadcast, never acknowledged. It was said to be preserved on magnetic reel, identical in appearance to the countless others NASA produced. But unlike those, this reel was marked, coded, and placed where only a select few could access it. Its contents, some said, were so unusual that they could not risk public release. At first, such talk was dismissed as the typical folklore of large organizations. Any place as vast and secretive as NASA would naturally breed rumors. But the story persisted, reappearing in interviews, in memoirs, even in the recollections of retired engineers who spoke cautiously, as if afraid to say too much. One account came from a technician who had worked at Houston's Mission Control during the late 1960s. In an informal interview decades later, he described handling reels of audio that were never destined for public ears. Some of them, he recalled, were tagged differently. We didn't log them the same way. They went into what we called the vault. When pressed on what the vault contained, he grew silent, then added, "There was one tape. People said it wasn't for us, higher clearance only. I never heard it myself. But the guys joked it was the moon music tape." The phrase caught, moon music tape. The very words sounded theatrical, like something out of pulp science fiction. And yet, buried inside the jest, was the kernel of belief that somewhere, in some locked drawer, was the raw record of what Apollo astronauts had heard when they thought no one else was listening. The culture of secrecy at NASA only fanned the flames. For while the agency projected transparency, endless press conferences, televised missions, public tours of Johnson Space Center, it also carried layers of classified projects, contracts, and data. Military involvement in Apollo was heavier than most realized, with the Department of Defense providing tracking stations, encryption systems, and even recovery operations. If something unusual had been recorded, it would not be unusual for it to be classified under the same umbrella as military communications. The result was a tantalizing paradox. NASA was both the most public and the most private of institutions. To the average citizen, it opened its doors. To those within, it drew lines of access that few could cross. And so the tape became legend. Stories diverged on what it contained. Some claimed it was simply the raw, unedited transmission of Apollo 10's music, preserved before being explained away as interference. Others insisted it came from a later mission, perhaps even Apollo 11, and captured something the astronauts had whispered when they believed their microphones were off. Still others said it wasn't human voices at all, that the tape carried sounds not attributable to static, to radio, or to any equipment failure, sounds that hinted at intelligence. Skeptics argued that such a tape, if it existed, would have surfaced. After all, NASA's archives are immense, but not impenetrable. Researchers and documentarians have combed them for decades. Surely someone would have stumbled across the evidence. But believers countered with the scale of those archives. NASA generated millions of feet of film, hundreds of thousands of images, and countless reels of audio across Apollo alone. Much of it was badly catalogued, misfiled, or simply buried under acronyms and technical jargon. Even in recent years, entire boxes of Apollo tapes have resurfaced in unexpected places. At universities, in government warehouses, even in private garages. Could the moon music tape be one of those lost relics, filed under some innocuous label, waiting to be rediscovered? The possibility was given weight by an incident in 2006 when NASA admitted it had misplaced the original slow-scan video recordings of the Apollo 11 moonwalk, the most iconic footage in human history, and the highest quality copy of it had simply vanished. It had been reused, recorded over, or stored incorrectly. The admission shocked the public, but to researchers it was unsurprising. NASA, for all its achievements, had always struggled with archival discipline. If entire reels of the first moon landing could disappear, Then the loss or concealment of a single tape was entirely plausible. That plausibility kept the story alive. Some journalists went further. A 1990s article in a fringe science magazine claimed that a retired NASA archivist had described the tape as containing structured signals, not random noise. The signals, according to the article, repeated at intervals, forming patterns, too regular to dismiss. The archivist allegedly refused to provide his name, fearing repercussions, but insisted the tape had been locked in a government storage facility, unlabeled, unacknowledged. Other accounts surfaced from the edges of conspiracy culture. Former contractors spoke anonymously of sensitive reels pulled from public circulation. A few even described attempts to copy them, thwarted by security protocols. One story told of a technician who had smuggled a reel home, only to have federal agents appear at his door days later, confiscating it without explanation. The tale is unverifiable, yet it circulates with the persistence of folklore. The very absence of hard evidence became, paradoxically, its own evidence. To those who believed, the lack of proof was precisely what proved the cover-up. After all, if there were nothing strange on the tape, why would it remain hidden? There is, of course, a more mundane explanation. Many Apollo recordings were never digitized, left to degrade in storage. Magnetic tape is fragile. It demagnetizes, it warps, it molds. A tape sealed away for decades could be little more than dust today. Perhaps the vault existed, and perhaps it held reels of unusual sound, but if so, they may already be lost to time. Yet even this possibility carries a haunting quality, because it suggests that the truth, whatever it was, slipped away not through malice, but through entropy. That humanity's brush with the inexplicable was recorded and then quietly erased by the passage of years. Still, the legend refuses to die. In the age of the internet, stories of the tape have spread further than NASA's own clarifications. YouTube videos dissect alleged leaks, layering eerie audio over grainy images of lunar craters. Podcasts speculate on the vault, painting it as a room of locked cabinets hidden in the bowels of Johnson Space Center. Online forums buzz with amateur archivists searching catalogs for mislabeled reels, and every so often, a new rumor breathes life into the hunt. In 2012, a blogger claimed to have obtained a partial transcript of an unreleased Apollo recording. The document, said to have been leaked from NASA's archives, described astronauts discussing tones and voices on the lunar surface. The transcript's authenticity has never been proven. It may well be a fabrication, but it reignited speculation that somewhere buried deep, a recording still waited. What makes the legend so powerful is not only the possibility of alien contact, but the deeper symbolism of a hidden tape. It represents the idea that even at the height of humanity's most public triumph, there were secrets, moments too strange, too disruptive to share. It reminds us that history is not only what is shown, but also what is concealed. And so, when people speak of the tape in the vault, they are not merely speaking of magnetic reels and archive boxes. They are speaking of the fear that the universe is stranger than we are allowed to know. They are speaking of trust, of whether the institutions we revere would hide the truth for our own good. They are speaking ultimately of silence, and the suspicion that silence is never empty. Because if such a tape exists, then it carries with it the one thing silence cannot: evidence. Not whispers, not rumors, not shadows in memory, but a record. A record that could be played, rewound, scrutinized. A record that could change the narrative forever. And it is this idea, that somewhere, perhaps even now, a reel of magnetic tape sits in darkness, holding the sound of the impossible, that keeps the legend alive. The tape may never surface, it may never be proven real, but in the imagination it is as tangible as any artifact, a reel marked with a code stored in a cabinet, waiting to tell us what silence itself could not. There are moments in human history when silence breaks in a way that can never be forgotten. The moon for all of time had been a silent companion, cold, distant, mute. Poets called it the eye of night. Astronomers called it a barren world. Even as astronauts prepared to set foot on its dusty surface, They carried the assumption that the moon was an object, not a voice. And yet, within the vault of rumor, within the shadows of testimony, there is a story that suggests otherwise. A story that claims, for one brief and disquieting moment, the moon itself spoke. The alleged recording at the center of this story has become a kind of myth. Its contents are said to be unmistakable, structured sounds, pulsing tones, something too ordered to be random, static. Some describe it as rhythmic, others as melodic, still others as an eerie approximation of a voice. Whatever the exact description, the implication is the same, that Apollo astronauts heard something that defied not only expectation, but explanation. The tale usually begins with Apollo 11. Humanity's first steps on another world are remembered for the words of Neil Armstrong, for the crackle of his voice carried across the void. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. But what the public heard was not all that was recorded. Hours of transmissions were logged, much of it mundane. Checklists, engineering notes, minor frustrations. Within that noise, according to some, there exists a section never released. Section where, amid the hum of equipment, another sound emerges. Those who claim to have heard it speak cautiously, as if aware that even repeating the story risks their credibility. One former contractor described it as a tone that repeated, not like a machine malfunction, not like feedback. It was deliberate. Another alleged witness compared it to music, though music of a kind no human instrument could easily create. It wasn't random. It had phrasing. It rose and fell like something alive. Skeptics, of course, point to countless technical explanations: radio interference, crosstalk between frequencies, oscillations caused by the lunar module's electronics. To believe in the tape, they argue, is to underestimate how fragile and noisy early communications technology could be. And yet, even within NASA's own documentation, there are references to unexplained audio anomalies that never reached the press. Could all of them be dismissed as coincidence? The heart of the story lies in what listeners describe as the quality of the sound. Static and feedback are messy, chaotic, but this was not chaos, it was pattern. A rising tone followed by a pause, a sequence of intervals that seemed to repeat. One listener even claimed to have charted it on paper, noting its regularity. The pattern, they insisted, was too precise to be dismissed. But if not interference, what then? Some theorists point to the idea of natural resonance. The moon, unlike Earth, is a hollowed-out world in some models, riddled with cavities from countless impacts. Seismic experiments conducted during Apollo revealed that when struck, the moon rang like a bell. The phrase was widely reported at the time, though scientists clarified it was a metaphor for the way seismic waves reverberated unusually long. Could the sounds on the tape have been the resonance of the moon itself, vibrating in strange harmonics that happened to be picked up by radio equipment? Others take the idea further. If the moon does resonate, they argue, then perhaps what was captured was not interference but the planet's voice, an unintentional, natural song of a celestial body. Just as whales sing across oceans, perhaps moons hum across space. The thought alone is unsettling. The idea that the ground beneath one's feet might not be inert, but alive with hidden tones, waiting only for the right instruments to listen. And then there are those who suggest something more. To some, the tape represents evidence not of geology, but of intelligence. The rhythms, the apparent structuring, the voice-like qualities, these are interpreted not as accident, but as message. The moon in this view is not merely a rock orbiting Earth, but a station, a construct, or at the very least a host for something unknown. What better place, conspiracists ask, for an ancient artifact or transmitter than the side of the moon? Always turned away from us, shielded from Earth's interference? This line of thought often drifts into speculation about ancient civilizations or extraterrestrial observation posts. The sound, they suggest, was not an accident, but a signal, a kind of calling card left in the ether. Perhaps the astronauts, with their radios tuned and their microphones open, stumbled across a frequency not meant for human ears. The most extreme claims interpret the alleged voice literally. They speak of words embedded in the tones, a language obscured by interference, but present nonetheless. Reports vary wildly. Some say the voice sounded mechanical, like a synthesized speech pattern. Others insist it carried an organic, almost mournful quality. A few even claim it resembled a chant, a repetition of syllables with no clear meaning. Such descriptions verge on the mythical, and perhaps that is why they linger. For humanity has always been haunted by the idea of celestial voices. Ancient cultures told of gods who spoke from the heavens, of omens whispered by stars and moons. To hear a voice on the moon, then, is not only a technical anomaly, it is the fulfillment of a timeless archetype. The sky, it seems, cannot remain silent forever. Psychologists, however, offer a different perspective. They remind us that the human brain is wired to find patterns, even where none exist. Auditory pareidolia, the tendency to perceive voices in random noise, is a well-documented phenomenon. From the hiss of static to the creak of old houses, people often hear whispers where there are none. Could the moon's voice be nothing more than astronauts, stressed and isolated, misinterpreting the randomness of interference as something more? The environment of spaceflight, after all, is uniquely disorienting. Long stretches of silence, punctuated by bursts of technical chatter, the ever-present hum of life support systems, the psychological weight of knowing that only thin walls separate you from a vacuum. Under such conditions, the mind can play tricks. A flicker of shadow becomes movement. A stray tone becomes music. A burst of static becomes a voice. And yet this explanation, while rational, does not erase the unease. Because those who claim to have heard the tape insist it did not sound like a trick. It did not sound like imagination. It sounded deliberate. Too deliberate. That is the core of the mystery, the gap between perception and proof. If the tape truly exists, then its contents could be analyzed, tested, broken down into spectrograms. Scientists could determine whether the tones fit natural frequencies, human-made signals, or something outside both categories. But without the tape, we are left only with testimonies, rumors, and the echo of a story too strange to die. And perhaps that is what unsettles us most. The idea that the evidence might exist, but remain hidden. That somewhere, in a box in a government warehouse, sits a reel of tape carrying the sound of the impossible. The reel that could, if released, reshape how humanity sees not just the moon, but the universe itself. Until then, the story lives in uncertainty. The moon may have spoken, or it may not have. The sounds may have been interference, resonance, or imagination. Each theory carries its own weight, its own unsettling implications. If it was interference, then why did trained astronauts describe it with such conviction? If it was resonance, then what does it mean that celestial bodies can sing? If it was imagination, then what does it reveal about the fragility of human perception at the edge of exploration? What makes the legend endure is not certainty, but ambiguity. The tape, whether real, lost, or fabricated, becomes a mirror for our deepest questions. Do we stand alone beneath the stars? Or are we surrounded by voices we have not yet learned to hear? The moon remains silent now. Its craters hold no microphones, its dust carries no recorders. And yet, for those who believe, there was once a night when the silence broke, a night when structured tones slipped into the ether, captured by human ears, preserved on fragile tape. A night when the moon spoke and humanity was not ready to listen. And if true, if even a fragment of the legend carries weight, then the implications ripple outward. Because a voice, any voice, cannot exist in isolation. A voice implies a source, a speaker, a presence. If the moon spoke, then something was speaking through it. And that possibility changes everything. The Cold War was never just about missiles or ideologies. It was about perception, about shadows cast longer than facts, about secrets so carefully guarded that they seemed to take on lives of their own. Every launch, every satellite, every capsule drifting above the Earth was not only a technological achievement, but also a statement of dominance. To reveal weakness was to risk collapse. To admit uncertainty was to hand the enemy a weapon. And so when whispers emerged of anomalies in space, strange signals, unexplained sounds, moments of static that felt alive, they were swallowed by the machinery of secrecy. The story of the moon's alleged voice, That fragmentary recording, said to capture something structured and impossible, could not have surfaced in a more delicate time. For in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the world was balanced precariously between two superpowers, whose distrust seeped into every orbit and every crater. To NASA and to the Soviet space program, anomalies were not curiosities. They were vulnerabilities. The United States, flush with the triumph of Apollo, understood that the moon landing was not just science but spectacle. It was proof of American ingenuity, a declaration that capitalism and democracy could literally reach beyond Earth. Any suggestion that the mission encountered the inexplicable, something beyond control, beyond human explanation, risked undermining that narrative. What would it look like if the astronauts, those paragons of discipline and courage, confessed to hearing music where there should have been only silence? What would it mean if the world believed the moon itself had spoken? The Soviet Union, too, carried its ghosts. Its cosmonauts flew under intense scrutiny, their successes broadcast as symbols of socialism's strength, their failures buried under layers of censorship. Rumors persist that several Soviet missions were lost in silence, their crews drifting into oblivion, their signals fading into the ether. Within such a culture, acknowledging anomalies would not have been permitted. To admit that something unknown intruded upon carefully monitored frequencies would have been to admit that the USSR was not in full control of the heavens it sought to dominate. And so, in both Washington and Moscow, silence became policy. Declassified. Documents from the era reveal how deeply communication anomalies troubled officials. The U.S. Air Force compiled reports on unidentified aerial phenomena, not because of fascination, but because of fear that the Soviets were testing advanced technology. Similarly, Soviet intelligence monitored American launches not simply to track rockets, but to capture stray transmissions, hoping to catch glimpses of secrets. In that atmosphere, every unexplained sound was suspect, every burst of static a potential cipher. It is within this tense backdrop that the story of the moon's alleged voice begins to feel less like myth and more like inevitability. If such a recording existed, both sides would have had reason to bury it. To the public, it would appear as evidence of something beyond human comprehension. But to generals and ministers, it would appear as a possible weapon, or worse, a vulnerability that could not be explained. Consider the timing. In 1969, the world watched as Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin planted the American flag in lunar dust. But just months before, Apollo 10 had carried its crew around the moon in a dress rehearsal for the landing. And it was on that mission, as later accounts revealed, that astronauts reported hearing outer space-type music. Their voices, captured on tape, carry unease. It sounds like, like outer space-type music. Who's going to believe it? When these transcripts emerged decades later, NASA downplayed them as radio interference between lunar module and command module frequencies. Yet even if that were true, the timing was dangerous. For in 1969, every anomaly was filtered through the lens of rivalry. If the Soviets had intercepted such transmissions, they might have spun them into propaganda. If the Americans admitted, to them they risked ridicule. In a war of appearances, silence was the safer option. But silence does not erase memory. Whispered accounts suggest that Soviet cosmonauts too encountered strange signals. The so-called lost cosmonauts conspiracy claims that early Soviet missions perished in orbit and were covered up, remains one of the Cold War's most enduring mysteries. Among these stories are tales of ground stations intercepting faint human voices distorted by static, pleading in Russian from failing spacecraft. Most historians dismiss these accounts as fabrications, products of Western propaganda, or amateur radio enthusiasts seeking attention. And yet, what unites these stories is the idea of voices, unexpected, unexplained, echoing through the void. The Cold War itself was an echo chamber. UFO reports spiked not only in the United States, but across the globe. Pilots described lights pacing their aircraft, objects performing maneuvers impossible by conventional means. Radar operators tracked blips that appeared and vanished like phantoms. Governments on both sides compiled files, stamped them secret, and locked them away. In such an environment, how easily might the moon's alleged voice have been filed alongside these incidents, another anomaly too dangerous to confront publicly? By the early 1970s, the paranoia had matured into policy. In the United States, Project Blue Book officially closed in 1969, concluding that UFOs posed no national security threat and offered no evidence of extraterrestrial craft. Yet behind closed doors, military and intelligence agencies continued to collect data. In the Soviet Union, secret committees studied reports of anomalous phenomena with equal intensity, though their conclusions rarely left classified channels. Both nations, while dismissing UFOs publicly, feared that the other might be using the unknown as cover for new technologies. In this crucible of suspicion, anomalies became weapons of perception. If the Soviets could convince the world that American astronauts had heard voices on the moon, it could tarnish NASA's credibility. If the Americans could dismiss or suppress such rumors, they preserved their image of mastery. Thus, the recording, if it existed, was not only a scientific puzzle but a political liability. And yet the Cold War also bred obsession. Intelligence agencies scoured every scrap of data for advantage. Could the moon's voice, if genuine, have been studied in secret? Laboratories. Could both nations have dissected its tones, searching for meaning, for patterns, for messages? Some researchers argue that the rush to develop advanced communication monitoring systems, satellite interception, deep space tracking, was driven not only by espionage, but by curiosity about anomalies. If the universe whispered, both superpowers wanted to be the first to decode it. The Cold War's cultural undercurrents only deepened the mystery. Science fiction surged in popularity, fueled by both awe and fear of space. Films depicted alien invasions, cosmic signals, encounters with intelligences beyond comprehension. Against this backdrop, the idea of the moon speaking fit too perfectly. Was it myth feeding fiction or fiction feeding myth? Did the rumors of astronauts hearing voices inspire writers, or did popular imagination make audiences more willing to believe such accounts? For many, the truth lies somewhere in between. The Cold War taught both governments and citizens to expect duplicity, to assume that what was said publicly was only half the story. If officials dismissed anomalies as interference, that very dismissal became suspicious. Secrecy became a breeding ground for speculation, and in that soil, the legend of the moon's voice grew roots. The echoes extended beyond spaceflight. In 1977, a radio telescope in Ohio detected the famous WOW signal, a 72-second burst from deep space that resembled no known natural emission. Though unrelated to the moon, it demonstrated how fragile, fleeting anomalies could ignite global fascination. If a ground-based antenna could stumble upon such a signal, why not a spacecraft orbiting another world? Why not Apollo? The Cold War ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union, but its shadows linger. In the years that followed, declassification brought glimpses into hidden archives. Documents revealed how seriously both nations took unexplained aerial and orbital phenomena. Files showed pilots describing glowing spheres, cosmonauts reporting unknown objects near their capsules, and intelligence analysts debating whether such sightings represented advanced enemy craft or something else entirely. In this context, the moon's alleged voice feels less like an isolated myth and more like part of a broader tapestry, a pattern of secrecy woven through decades of fear. Perhaps that is why the legend refuses to die, because it is not only a story about astronauts and a tape in a vault. It is a story about power, about how nations wage war not just with weapons but with silence. The Cold War was fought with narratives as much as with missiles. And in that war, a voice on the moon was too dangerous to acknowledge. What is most unsettling is not that the tape may exist, but that if it does, it might have been studied in secret for decades, its conclusions locked away, its mysteries known but unspoken. What if in the halls of some intelligence agency, the moon's song was analyzed, catalogued, perhaps even understood? And what if the decision was made, not to share, not to reveal, but to bury? History's loudest secrets are often those hidden in plain sight. There are stories that survive in whispers, passed quietly from one pair of lips to another, fragile as moth wings in the dark. But every now and then, one of those whispers grows teeth. It comes from someone who should know better, someone whose life has been spent in the quiet corridors of record rooms, where dust motes float like constellations, and history is filed away not by narrative, but by number. In the mythology surrounding Apollo's strange transmissions, one such figure emerges: the archivist. The archivist's story begins not with rockets or astronauts, but with reels of tape. Imagine the bowels of a government facility, where fluorescent lights flicker overhead and metal shelves stretch for miles. Boxes are stacked in endless rows, their labels handwritten, their contents forgotten. There is no glamour here, only the hum of old ventilation systems, the faint smell of paper gone brittle with age, and the unshakable sense that time itself has been locked in place. This is where the archivist lived out his career, cataloguing, preserving, guarding the ephemera of a century that could never quite decide if it wanted to remember or forget. By his own admission, he had not sought adventure. He was not an astronaut, not a soldier, not a scientist. He was a clerk of memory. His world was microfilm readers and index cards, reels and spools of audio-magnetic tape stored under climate-controlled conditions. He had no reason to believe he would encounter anything other than boredom, punctuated by the occasional glimpse into history. But history has a way of revealing itself to the patient. It began with a routine request. A researcher, he recalled, had submitted a clearance form for Apollo-era audio, specifying raw transmissions between mission control and astronauts. Such requests were not unusual. Scholars often sifted through data, searching for the overlooked detail, the phrase that could anchor a paper. The archivist retrieved the requested tapes from their assigned shelf, reels marked with stenciled codes, and prepared them for duplication. He threaded one onto a playback deck, an old machine that smelled faintly of warmed dust and oil, and pressed play. Static. Voices. Familiar rhythms of checklists and telemetry, the clipped professional tones of astronauts confirming data. He had heard dozens like it before, but then something else. A pause in the conversation, a hesitation, then a sound that was not voice and not static, something that seemed to pulse with structure, rhythmic, measured, almost like music. The archivist froze. He listened as the astronaut spoke again, their words tinged with confusion, their tone somewhere between amusement and unease. "You hear that?" one voice asked. Another responded, nervous laughter breaking through. "Yeah, it's strange." "Huh? Sounds like, I don't know, whistling? Music?" The tape rolled on, the sound lingering, then fading into silence. He sat back, heart racing. The archivist had been trained to treat anomalies as clerical issues, a glitch, a mislabel, perhaps interference caught on the line. But this was different. It was too clear, too structured, too deliberate. He rewound, played it again, and again. The sound refused to resolve into anything ordinary. It was not interference, it was presence. For weeks afterward, he could not let it go. He revisited the shelves, searching through adjacent boxes, cross-referencing catalog numbers. He found more reels from the same mission, some labeled with odd notations in fading ink. Review, do not duplicate, hold. Many of these tapes carried nothing unusual, but then, buried among the chatter and static, fragments appeared, tones repeating at intervals, faint hums that seemed to carry intention. They were always brief, always elusive, as if designed to slip beneath notice. But once heard, they gnawed at him. He spoke of it once, cautiously, to a colleague. The man gave him a look of practiced indifference and muttered, "Don't chase ghosts, you'll regret it." The archivist never mentioned it again, but in the silence of the vault, when no one else remained, he found himself drawn back to those tapes. The reels became companions, the strange sounds like voices in the dark, whispering secrets he could not decipher. Years passed. He rose in seniority. His hair turned grey and the vault filled with even more forgotten history. Digital storage came, and the old reels were boxed up, marked for disposal or deep archive. Yet he kept a mental map of where they lay, the anomalies hidden like seeds beneath the soil. To anyone else, they were just obsolete media. To him, they were the closest thing to proof that the universe was not as silent as we pretend. It was near the end of his career when he decided to tell his story. He spoke not to the press, not to his superiors, but to a trusted acquaintance, a journalist whose fascination with Cold War secrecy had led her into strange corners of history. In a dimly lit diner, over the clink of coffee cups and the hiss of a fryer, he leaned forward and whispered, "There's a tape, I heard it myself. The moon, it wasn't silent." The journalist listened, skeptical at first, then transfixed as he described the sound. He spoke with the calm of a man who had spent decades among facts and files, who knew the difference between rumor and record. Yet there was something haunted in his eyes, as though speaking the words out loud threatened to unravel him. He would not name the specific reels. He claimed it was too dangerous, that even in retirement there were lines that could not be crossed. But he offered details, the cataloging codes, the peculiar notations, the way certain boxes seemed to vanish from the shelves after periodic audits. "They know it's there," he said. "They've always known. But they'd rather let it rot in silence than admit what it means." The journalist pressed him. What did it mean? What did he believe the sound was? The archivist shook his head. "I don't know. I only know it wasn't supposed to be there. It wasn't human and it wasn't static. It was something else, something that made the astronauts nervous. And that was enough to make the rest of us keep quiet. It was the kind of story that could ruin reputations or ignite obsessions." The journalist wrote notes, then tucked them away, unsure if she believed. But the archivist returned to his vault, back to his dim corridors and shelves heavy with silence, carrying the weight of what he had heard. Accounts of him differ. Some say he retired quietly, vanishing into anonymity, leaving behind nothing but a pension and an empty desk. Others claim he smuggled out copies of the reels, hiding them in safety deposit boxes, passing them down like contraband heirlooms. There are whispers that fragments of his recordings surfaced briefly in underground circles. Grainy audio passed from hand to hand, always too distorted to prove, always just enough to tease belief. What is undeniable is the persistence of his tale. The archivist's secret became a thread woven into the larger tapestry of Apollo's mysteries. Conspiracy theorists clung to it as validation, while skeptics dismissed it as fabrication. But in the half-light of those vaults, amid shelves that stretched like cathedrals of forgotten truth, one man had heard something that should not exist. The imagery lingers. A single reel of magnetic tape, spinning slowly on a deck, its oxide surface shimmering under fluorescent light, a hiss of static, then a pulse, a tone, a rhythm like breath across the void, a sound that seemed to carry intention, as if the moon itself had leaned close to whisper. And if that whisper was real, then history had been edited not just by governments but by silence itself. The archivist's story is not a confession, it is a doorway. It suggests that within the labyrinth of official archives there are corridors we have never walked, shelves we have never searched, tapes we have never heard. And in those forgotten spools, the universe may be speaking, waiting for someone patient enough or reckless enough to listen. One voice leads us deeper into the labyrinth of silence. When the Apollo astronauts left behind seismometers on the moon, they expected to gather quiet data, the faint tremors caused by meteorite impacts, the gentle stress of tidal forces, the occasional echo of human intervention. What they did not expect was for the moon to behave unlike any celestial body previously studied. On Earth, earthquakes reverberate and then fade within minutes. Energy dissipates quickly through our planet's dynamic mantle and liquid core. But on the moon, seismic events lingered. When a lunar module ascent stage was deliberately crashed into the surface in 1969, the instruments recorded something astonishing. The moon rang for nearly an hour, the vibrations echoing like a struck bell. This was not an isolated incident. Over subsequent missions, additional impacts, whether spent rocket stages or natural meteor strikes, produced similarly prolonged reverberations. The data suggested a body far less dense, far less dampened than planetary scientists had anticipated. The phrase "the moon rang like a bell" became shorthand for one of Apollo's strangest scientific puzzles, a mystery that has never quite been solved. The question was deceptively simple: why does the moon resonate? Our planet, with its molten outer core and semi-fluid mantle, absorbs seismic energy efficiently. Shockwaves are swallowed by heat and motion. The moon, however, is dry, rigid, and brittle. Instead of swallowing energy, it seems to let vibrations ricochet through its interior, bouncing like sound in a cathedral of stone. Some scientists explained it by pointing to the moon's extreme dryness. With little water to lubricate and dampen seismic waves, the energy simply traveled farther, echoing endlessly through fractures and cavities. But others wondered if this explanation was too neat, too convenient. If the moon's interior was so effective at amplifying and sustaining vibration, then perhaps its structure was stranger than we dared to imagine. There are models, drawn up in the years following Apollo, that describe the moon's interior as layered in surprising ways. Unlike Earth's molten heart, the moon's core appears small, partially molten at best, surrounded by a thick mantle that may contain voids or pockets of low density. Some researchers suggested the moon might be honeycombed with vast fractures, the scars of ancient impacts that never fully healed. In such a lattice, seismic waves could travel long distances without dying out, weaving an acoustic web beneath the surface. This would explain the bell-like ringing, not a literal hollow, but a complex system of echoes amplified by the peculiar stiffness of lunar rock. And yet the imagery was irresistible. To say the moon rang like a bell was to suggest it might be hollow, a shell rather than a solid body, a vessel waiting to be filled. Speculative thinkers seized on this idea. Hollow moon theories, fringe as they are, found fuel in the Apollo seismic data. Could it be, they asked, that the moon was not a natural satellite at all, but some kind of construct, an ancient artifact, a sphere built around a shell of void space? Such ideas veer quickly into the fantastical, invoking alien engineers or lost civilizations, but the seed of their imagination is undeniably rooted in the genuine strangeness of the data. For the average person, the notion that the moon should echo like struck metal seemed to challenge the very definition of a natural celestial body. Planets, after all, are not supposed to sound this way. But what, then, of sound itself? In the vacuum above the moon, sound cannot travel. There is no atmosphere to carry vibrations, no medium through which waves can propagate to human ears. This is why space is silent, why astronauts could only communicate via radio signals rather than shouts across the void. Yet beneath the lunar crust, inside its rigid stone, vibration is plentiful. Seismic energy is, in a way, a kind of sound, slowed and deepened, inaudible to ears, but detectable by instruments. When scientists listened to the moon's quakes, what they heard was an alien music of resonance, a body that did not sigh, but instead hummed, sustained and eerie. Theories multiplied. Some focused on composition. The moon, they noted, is unusually light compared to Earth. Its density is lower than expected, suggesting a scarcity of heavy metals in its core. Others speculated that ancient impacts had stripped the moon of much of its original mass, leaving it fractured and skeletal. A few proposed that the moon may have been captured by Earth's gravity long ago, dragged from another part of the solar system, its alien composition explaining its peculiar resonance. If true, the moon might not only be strange in structure but foreign in origin, a traveler locked in orbit, forever circling but never revealing its true past. Mainstream science treads carefully here. To admit the strangeness is one thing. To indulge the wilder interpretations is another. The phrase "rings like a bell" is often softened in textbooks, explained away as a quirk of geology rather than a hint of hollowness. And yet, even in cautious language, the unease lingers. The moon does not behave like Earth. It is not merely smaller, it is fundamentally other, as though it were designed according to rules we do not fully grasp. Consider also the psychological weight of resonance. To hear or imagine hearing a body vibrate with such persistence is to assign it voice. Sound has always been the language of presence, the medium through which life declares itself. On Earth, when mountains rumble or caverns echo, We instinctively ascribe personality to the stone. To learn that the moon resonates for hours after impact is to imagine it speaking back, humming to itself in frequencies too deep for us to hear. It turns a dead world into something animate, a body with memory, one that refuses to let go of the energy given to it. In fringe communities, this is taken further. Some theorists suggest the moon's resonance is not just a geological quirk, but a message, a signal, perhaps, hidden in vibration, accessible only to those who know how to translate seismic hum into frequency. They point to Apollo's reports of strange radio sounds and propose that what the astronauts heard may not have been electromagnetic interference, but resonance itself bleeding into transmission. A voice not of biology, but of geology, or perhaps of something using geology as its instrument. To these thinkers, the moon is less an object than a device, a vast resonant chamber capable of shaping frequencies beyond our comprehension. And yet, for all its speculation, science continues to probe with caution. Instruments placed by Apollo have long since fallen silent, their batteries dead, their signals lost to the static of time. What remains are old data sets, archives of vibration waiting to be reanalyzed with modern tools. Some researchers have indeed revisited them, noting that the prolonged quakes suggest a body with few mechanisms for damping energy. The moon is dry, cold, and fractured, conditions that make it a natural echo chamber. And yet, even these rational voices admit the ringing is peculiar, and no model quite captures it in full. The moon is not hollow, they say, but neither is it simple. For the astronauts, the resonance was not an abstract data point, but a palpable phenomenon. They felt the quakes through the ground beneath their boots, the subtle shifts in gravity, the knowledge that the surface beneath them was not stable but reverberant. Imagine standing on a world where every step seems to linger, where every impact whispers across miles. The unease was not scientific, but existential. They were standing on a drumhead, a body that refused silence. The metaphor deepens when one considers culture. Bells are not only instruments but symbols. They call communities to prayer, to warning, to attention. To say the moon rang like a bell is to suggest it was announcing something, broadcasting not just to seismometers, but to us. Perhaps this is why the phrase captured the public imagination so fiercely, why it slipped into conspiracy and folklore alike. The moon did not merely vibrate, it spoke in the only language available to stone, and so we are left with dual interpretations. One is scientific. The moon resonates because it is brittle, dry, and fractured, its seismic properties distinct from Earth's. The other is symbolic. The resonance is a sign, a voice, an anomaly that refuses to be ignored. Between the two lies a mystery not easily dismissed. For if the moon is more resonant than expected, if it amplifies rather than dampens, then perhaps it is capable of more than we know. Perhaps it has always been humming, a background note in the symphony of the solar system, waiting for us to tune in. It is tempting to wonder what else might resonate within that silence. Could the tape the archivist described have captured not interference, but the moon's own hum? Could the strange whistles and music reported by astronauts be harmonics of seismic vibration bleeding through equipment? Or could resonance itself be a conduit for something stranger, a bridge between natural and unnatural, where frequencies meet in tension? These are questions science has not answered, perhaps cannot answer, for they straddle the line between geology and myth. What remains undeniable is this: the moon is not silent. It rings, it echoes, it remembers. Long after impacts have ended, long after vibrations should fade, it continues to hum like a struck bell, as though it refuses to let go of the energy it has been given. And in that persistence lies a riddle. For if silence is the default state of the cosmos, then resonance is rebellion, a declaration that even stone can sing. But science alone could not contain the unease. In the history of exploration, the line between what is officially remembered and what is quietly whispered is often wide. Nowhere is this truer than in the legacy of the Apollo astronauts, those few human beings who walked on another world and returned not only with samples of dust and stone, but with memories that seemed to flicker between wonder and something harder to explain. NASA, meticulous in its record-keeping, produced thousands of pages of transcripts, audio logs, and mission reports. These documents are precise, technical, often stripped of emotion. They tell us when an astronaut deployed a seismometer, when oxygen levels were checked, when a camera malfunctioned. Yet those who lived inside the suits, staring out across the alien plains of the moon, sometimes told different stories when the microphones were off and the decades had softened official secrecy. There are memoirs that drop peculiar sentences, interviews that circle around forbidden subjects, and rumors of words spoken but excised from the historical record. Among them emerges the shadow of one figure in particular, an astronaut who, for some, spoke too much. The tale is not straightforward, and perhaps that is what makes it compelling. Official transcripts are clear. Every word spoken between Houston and the crew is logged, preserved, archived. There is no space. It would seem for erasure. Yet rumors persist that during certain missions, transmissions were cut, recordings lost, or words later altered in publication. The astronauts themselves, loyal to both duty and reputation, rarely contradicted the official record. But memory is porous, and in the twilight years of their lives, some allowed themselves to wander into recollections that unsettled more than clarified. One in particular, whose name we need not pin down to a single identity, for his story is stitched together from many fragments, hinted that what he experienced on the moon was not what the public was told. In interviews given years after his mission, he would pause as though testing the air before continuing. He spoke of standing on the surface in the hours between duties, gazing across the landscape, and hearing something, not a voice in his headset, not the chatter of Houston, but something that seemed to come from the silence itself. He described it as a rhythm, a pulse, almost like music. He said it was faint, easily dismissed as interference, but it lingered. When pressed by journalists, he would retreat into vagueness, smile, and redirect the conversation to the triumphs of Apollo. But in quieter settings, with friends or biographers, his language grew stranger. It wasn't silence out there, he said once. The silence had a texture, like it was full of something waiting to be heard. Such remarks have been interpreted in many ways. Some suggest he was speaking poetically, that the isolation of the moon had sharpened his imagination. Others insist he was hinting at something real, something recorded but never released. What lends his story weight is the tension between what appears in official mission transcripts and what colleagues later recalled. There are moments, brief silences, strange breaks in communication when the feed between moon and Earth cuts out, sometimes for only seconds, sometimes longer. NASA explained these as ordinary technical issues, yet for those inclined toward suspicion, such breaks became fertile ground for speculation. Was this where the unspeakable words were spoken? Was this when he said what he later could not unsay? Their story circulated in the years after the mission that during one of these gaps the astronaut described structures on the horizon, geometric shapes that did not appear natural. Another rumor claimed he saw lights flickering along the edge of a crater, as if the moon itself was lit from within. These stories have no confirmation in NASA's logs. They appear only in the retellings of enthusiasts, in the margins of conspiracy, books, and in the cryptic smiles of the astronaut himself when asked directly. He never confirmed, he never denied. He simply let the questions hang, as though silence was safer than clarity. In one memoir draft, never published in full, but quoted by researchers, the astronaut allegedly wrote of an impression that we were not alone. He did not specify whether he meant other spacecraft, other beings, or merely the overwhelming presence of the moon itself, vast and watchful. His editors persuaded him to remove the passage, arguing that it would distract from the scientific achievement. But copies of drafts survive, and in them his hesitation is palpable. He was a man torn between loyalty to the image of Apollo and a deeper need to express something stranger, something that would not leave him. Other astronauts, too, dropped peculiar hints. One, when asked about the so-called space music, heard on the far side of the moon during Apollo 10, said, "It was real, but nobody wanted to talk about it." Another, decades later, suggested that not all of the tapes from the missions had been made public. Yet it was this particular astronaut, the one who spoke too much, who seemed unable to let the memory go. In public lectures, he would sometimes wander into descriptions of the moon's living silence, words that startled his audiences but were quickly buried under patriotic anecdotes. It was as if he wanted to confess but could not bear the consequences of confession. Why would such a man hold back? The answer lies partly in the culture of the time. Astronauts were not simply explorers. They were symbols of national pride, embodiments of discipline, loyalty, and control. To speak of strange experiences, to hint at anomalies that smacked of the paranormal, was to risk ridicule, career damage, and the erosion of trust in the very program that had lifted them to glory. The Cold War climate magnified this pressure. The United States could not afford to appear irrational, to indulge in speculation that might suggest weakness. Every astronaut knew this, and so they buried their strangeness in silence or in carefully chosen words that could be dismissed as metaphor. But memory has its own gravity, pulling the mind back toward what it cannot forget. Those who knew him personally described a kind of haunted quality in his later years. He was proud of his service, proud of the mission, but when asked about his time on the moon, his eyes sometimes darkened. "You can't imagine what it feels like to be out there," he told one interviewer. "It's not just the distance, it's the presence of the place, it's aware of you." Such statements have been dismissed as the poetic musings of an aging man. Yet those who listened closely felt a different weight in his words: awareness, presence. These are not terms of geology or physics, they are terms of encounter. The tension between official transcripts and private recollection creates a kind of echo chamber, much like the moon's own resonance. We hear the official line clearly, technical data, sterile and precise. But beneath it, faintly, we hear another sound, the lingering vibration of memory, unsteady, resistant to silence. Did he truly hear something unexplainable? Did he truly glimpse something outside the frame of public record? Or did the isolation of space, the stress of the mission, and the imagination of later years distort what was real into something more? The answer may never be certain, but the possibility alone reshapes how we read the history of Apollo. It is tempting to see in his story a parable about truth itself. In one version, he is a man who carried a burden he could not share, who tried to speak but spoke too much, leaving only fragments behind. In another, he is a victim of conspiracy, silenced by forces that demanded the clean image of triumph over the messy possibility of mystery. And in yet another, he is simply human, grappling with the enormity of an experience that no language could contain, reaching for words that would always fall short. Each interpretation reveals as much about us as it does about him. Our hunger for hidden truths, our suspicion of official narratives, our fear that the most important secrets are the ones we will never be allowed to hear. The astronaut's story thus becomes a mirror of the moon itself, partly illuminated, partly shadowed, always withholding as much as it reveals. We see the bright surface, the flag, the footprints, the great speeches of victory, but beneath lies the dark side, the unsaid words, the edited transcripts, the memories that refuse to vanish. Just as the moon hides its far side from us, so, too, does history hide the full truth of what those men experienced. Perhaps that is why his story endures, whispered in interviews, dissected in documentaries, passed along in late-night conversations. It is not merely about whether he saw lights or heard music. It is about the possibility that the official story is never the whole story, that even the greatest triumphs of human history are threaded with shadows. The man who spoke too much reminds us that silence can be manufactured, and that truth, like vibration, can linger long after the instruments have gone quiet. In the end, what he left us was not a confession, but a question. Did he mean what we think he meant? Did he see what he suggested? Did he hear what no one was meant to hear? A slip of memory, a slip of truth, or a slip too dangerous to reveal. The words hover unresolved, like an echo fading into the silence of space. When we imagine space, we imagine silence. The image has been reinforced in countless films and school lessons, a black void, infinite and mute, where no air exists to carry sound. Yet, like so many truths in science, the statement is both right and wrong at once. Space does not echo with sound the way Earth does, for there is no atmosphere to transmit the familiar vibrations of voice or music. But silence is not absolute. Space hums. It whispers. It sings in languages that do not belong to the ear, but to instruments capable of translating plasma waves, electromagnetic oscillations, and charged particles into frequencies we can hear. And once those sounds are converted, they do not resemble silence at all. They resemble choirs of ghosts. NASA and ESA have long been custodians of these strange recordings. From the earliest days of probes sent to the edge of our solar system, to the most recent plasma wave receivers on spacecraft like Voyager, Cassini, or Cluster, humanity has been listening to the universe with new kinds of ears. And what we have found is unsettling in its beauty. The void is not void. It is alive with sound. One of the earliest revelations came from Voyager. As those twin spacecraft crossed the outer planets, they carried plasma wave detectors sensitive to the vibrations of charged particles in space. When those signals were converted into audio, they became eerie, wavering tones, rising and falling like electronic choirs. Around Jupiter, Voyager recorded what sounded like a chorus of flutes and whistles, as though the planet itself were speaking in breathless syllables. Near Saturn, the sounds became deeper, almost organ-like, resonant with an otherworldly majesty. And when Voyager reached the boundary of the heliosphere, the bubble of solar wind that shields our solar system, the detectors picked up what scientists described as a low, steady droning, like the deep hum of the universe itself. Cassini, orbiting Saturn decades later, added new verses to the cosmic symphony. When it plunged through Saturn's rings, its instruments captured bursts of sound like static mixed with bells, each ring particle striking the detector's sensors in a rhythm both chaotic and patterned. Cassini also heard the auroras of Saturn, charged, particles spiraling along magnetic field lines, emitting radio waves that, when translated, resembled strange bird calls echoing through an alien dawn. These were not accidents of interpretation. They were data, real evidence of the universe's activity, dressed in frequencies our ears could finally touch. Earth, too, is not silent. Our planet sings constantly. The magnetosphere crackles with whistlers, radio waves triggered by lightning strikes that travel along magnetic field lines, stretching into space and bending back. When recorded, these whistlers sound like descending whistles, electronic sighs that begin high and slide down, in pitch eerie in their elegance. In the 1960s, astronauts themselves heard them during missions, reporting strange swooping tones that engineers later confirmed as natural plasma waves translated through their headsets. It was a reminder that even above the cradle of Earth, in the thin edge of near space, silence was an illusion. ESA's Cluster mission, launched in 2000, took this further. The 4 spacecraft flying in formation around Earth recorded symphonies of plasma waves and magnetospheric storms. Some of the sounds resembled howls, others the steady thrum of a cosmic engine. Scientists gave them poetic names: chorus emissions, lion roars, hiss. Each was the product of physical processes, electrons spiraling, plasma compressing, fields vibrating, but to human ears, they were songs from the void. Listening to them, one could not help but feel both wonder and unease. They sounded alive. The deeper the listening, the stranger the music became. The sun itself sings, though not in frequencies we can hear directly. Its surface oscillates, rippling like a vast drum. Helioseismology, an entire field of science, studies these vibrations, translating them into data that, when converted into audible tones, sound like a roaring furnace crossed with the deep toll of bells. Even stars beyond our sun can be heard in this way. Kepler, the space telescope famed for finding exoplanets, also recorded stellar oscillations. Scientists turned those into sounds, giving us the ability to hear the heartbeat of distant suns. Taken together, these recordings build a startling truth. The universe is not silent. It is a symphony of plasma and field, of wave and oscillation. Each world, each star, each storm sings in its own register. The sounds are not artifacts of imagination. They are measurable, recordable, real. Yet they carry an otherness that cannot be ignored. We are accustomed to associating sound with life, with breath, with voice. To hear it in the vacuum of space feels like a violation of expectation, as though the cosmos itself were communicating in a language we are only beginning to decipher. For decades, NASA has released some of these recordings to the public, often with little fanfare. They are tucked into archives posted on websites, or included in press releases that most of the world ignores. Yet for those who stumble across them, they leave a lasting impression. Listening to the music of Jupiter, or the sounds of Earth's magnetosphere, can feel like listening to a choir of lost souls, calling out across unimaginable distances. The tones are at once mechanical and organic, electronic and spiritual. They resonate with something deep inside us, reminding us that the boundary between science and mystery is not as sharp as we pretend. And so when whispers emerge that the moon itself produced a sound different from all these plasma waves and cosmic frequencies, it becomes impossible to dismiss. Because by now, we know, the cosmos sings. Every world has its voice. Earth howls, Jupiter whistles, Saturn hums, the sun tolls like a bell. Why then would the moon be silent? What makes the lunar mystery stand apart is not that sound exists, but the kind of sound whispered about. Plasma waves and electromagnetic oscillations are explainable, expected in their strangeness. But the stories of the moon describe something else, resonance that rings like a bell, echoes that suggest hollow chambers, and more unsettlingly, recordings said to resemble voices or music. Not the anonymous chatter of charged particles, but something closer to us, something uncomfortably human. To understand why this matters, consider again Voyager's recordings. They are alien, yes, but abstract. Few would mistake them for the voice of a person. They inspire awe, not fear. The moon's alleged sound, however, carries a different implication. If plasma can whistle and stars can drum, the moon might hum too. But if the moon's hum resembled language, rhythm, or song, it would blur the line between natural and intentional. That is what makes the rumors dangerous. They suggest that, in the nearest world to Earth, there is not only resonance but communication. Scientists who have spoken cautiously on the subject often frame it as metaphor. The moon rings like a bell, they say, when describing seismic data from Apollo experiments. The phrase is meant to illustrate the extended vibration of the lunar crust after impacts, but outside the scientific community, the phrase has been taken literally. If the moon rings, does it sing? And if it sings, what is the song? Here lies the connective tissue between the cosmic symphony recorded by Voyager and the whispered tape said to exist in NASA's vault. One set of sounds is public, available for all to hear: the howls of magnetospheres, the whistles of plasma. They confirm that the universe is never silent. The other sound, if it exists, remains hidden, locked away not because it is too strange, but perhaps because it is too familiar. For what could be more unsettling than finding that our closest companion in space, the moon we see each night, has a voice that sounds like something we already know? Imagine for a moment the astronauts themselves. They had heard the whistlers of Earth, the crackle of radio interference, the static of cosmic radiation. All of these could be explained, but standing on the surface of the moon, surrounded by silence so profound it pressed against the bones, to hear even the faintest suggestion of rhythm or tone, something that felt intentional, would be enough to leave a scar in memory. It would explain the pauses in interviews, the strange metaphors about silence having texture, the hints dropped by those who perhaps spoke too much. Songs from the void remind us that we are not listeners to a silent cosmos, but participants in a universe alive with vibration. Every planet, every star, every charged particle contributes to the great choir. And yet, amid this cosmic orchestra, one sound stands apart. It is not the whistle of Earth, not the hum of Saturn, not the chorus of Jupiter. It is not the roar of the sun or the heartbeat of distant stars. It is something closer, quieter, whispered, not by the vast cosmos, but by the moon itself, the world nearest to us, reflecting our light, shaping our tides, holding secrets we are not meant to hear. And that, perhaps, is why it was hidden. Because to hear the songs of the void is to feel awe, but to hear the song of the moon is to feel unease. It is to realize that silence was never silence, that the nearest companion in our night sky might be less an empty rock than a resonant instrument, an instrument playing a song we were never meant to understand. But one sound stood apart, whispered not by the cosmos, but by our closest companion. In every great mystery, there comes a moment when those who pursue the truth turn toward the machinery of record. Requests, archives, paper trails. Legends and rumors can be dismissed as campfire stories, but documents, files, and official statements carry the weight of institutions. When whispers began to circulate about an alleged lunar recording, a sound captured by Apollo astronauts, stored by NASA, and never released, it was inevitable that researchers, journalists, and curious citizens would try to prise it into daylight through the only tool available to them, the Freedom of Information Act. The Freedom of Information Act, or FOA, is often romanticized as a skeleton key, unlocking dusty drawers in government basements. In reality, it is a labyrinth. Requests are submitted, reviewed, delayed, denied, appealed, and often returned, covered in black ink. Those who have walked this path before know the ritual well. The waiting months for replies, the joy of receiving a fat envelope, and the dismay of finding whole pages redacted into silence. For those hunting the lunar tape, this ritual became their entire journey. The first wave of requests began in the late 1970s, only a few years after Apollo had ended. Journalists, emboldened by the era's investigative spirit, still fresh from Watergate, sought every scrap of Apollo documentation. Some were focused on engineering and budget details. Others were drawn to the human angle. What had the astronauts really seen and heard? A handful of requests specifically mentioned audio anomalies or unexplained recordings from Apollo missions. Most were met with boilerplate replies, no responsive records found. Others returned lists of audio files with nothing unusual attached. The silence seemed conclusive, until it wasn't. In the 1980s, another set of researchers tried again, this time spurred by the growth of UFO subculture. Popular magazines published stories about strange music heard on the far side of the moon. A now famous claim circulated that Apollo 10 astronauts had picked up a space music signal, and while NASA later confirmed that this was merely radio interference, the story gave momentum to those who suspected something more. FOIA requests multiplied. Some asked for all Apollo 10 audio recordings, including anomalies. Others went broader. All Apollo mission logs referencing unusual sound. Responses came back piecemeal. Boxes of tapes were listed, but researchers who requested them were told the material was inaccessible due to deterioration or format obsolescence. A few lucky individuals who received reels discovered only static, comm chatter, and long stretches of nothing. By the 1990s, the hunt had grown desperate. FOIA requests were met with greater resistance, often under the convenient excuse of burden. NASA argued that searching decades-old archives for vague descriptions like unusual audio would require unreasonable resources. Some appeals went through, forcing the release of indexes, but again, nothing concrete appeared. A few researchers even took to filing requests with the Department of Defense, suspecting that if a sensitive recording did exist, NASA would not hold it alone. These efforts, too, were met with silence or referrals back to NASA. It was a bureaucratic Ouroboros, a snake devouring its own tail, endlessly circling the void. The digital age should have changed everything. By the early 2000s, NASA had begun digitizing its Apollo archives, releasing thousands of hours of audio, video, and transcript material to the public. Enthusiasts combed through the files line by line, waveform by waveform, searching for anything anomalous. A few oddities were found, strange bursts of noise, unexplained distortions, but none matched the legend of a hidden tape that revealed the moon's secret voice. For some, this was proof that the tape had never existed. For others, it was evidence of deliberate omission. After all, digitization projects are curated. Someone chooses what is included and what is quietly left behind. In 2005, a journalist named Daniel Kerr tried a different approach. He filed FOIA requests not for tapes, but for correspondence, letters, memos, and internal communications about Apollo audio. His logic was simple. Even if the recording itself was missing, traces of discussion about it might remain. Months later, he received a stack of heavily redacted documents. They were memos between NASA divisions, discussing archival material and audio review, but entire paragraphs were obscured with thick black bars. In one letter, the phrase, "Further dissemination is not recommended," appeared in the clear, followed by a full page of redactions. Kerr published what he found, framing it not as proof but as suggestion. His article, "The Sound That Wasn't There," circulated quietly in fringe communities. For some, it was the smoking gun. For others, it was just another pile of shadows. What made matters worse was the inconsistency of testimony. A handful of retired NASA employees, when pressed in interviews, admitted to hearing rumors of a strange tape. One archivist claimed he had seen a reel labeled with unusual notes, but could not recall details. A contractor insisted he had overheard engineers discussing voice-like anomalies picked up during Apollo 17. But every story crumbled under scrutiny. Memory is unreliable, and the further from the events, the more distorted recollections became. Some swore the recording had been destroyed. Others claimed it had been classified. Still others denied it ever existed. The contradictions only deepened the mystery. By the 2010s, the hunt for the tape had taken on a folkloric quality. Independent researchers submitted FOIA requests in waves, often networking online to compare results. They traded rejection letters like baseball cards, searching for inconsistencies. One request would be denied on grounds of no records, while another, nearly identical, would return a vague list of items withheld in full. Patterns emerged, but no answers. Some researchers concluded that the story was nothing more than a myth woven from real but unrelated phenomena. Apollo, seismic data, the Apollo 10 space music, and the public's fascination with cosmic sounds. Others refused to let go, convinced that the very persistence of denial was evidence of a deeper truth. Journalists who pursued the story found themselves trapped in a hall of mirrors. Editors hesitated to greenlight features about a recording that might not exist. Those who pushed forward found their leads dissolving into dead ends. Phone calls to former astronauts were politely rebuffed. NASA press officers repeated the same lines about no such tape. Attempts to trace FOIA appeals through legal channels stalled in the swamp of bureaucracy. One investigator compared it to chasing smoke in a windstorm. Perhaps the most telling clue lay not in what was revealed, but in what was absent. Far across decades of Apollo archives, hundreds of thousands of documents, there was remarkably little mention of audio anomalies. Given the scale of the missions, one would expect stray notes, offhand remarks, technical comments. Instead, the subject seemed scrubbed, or perhaps never written down at all. Silence where there should have been noise. To some, this was the clearest sign of censorship. To others, it was proof that there was nothing to censor. The frustration among researchers took on a psychological weight. Some described the process as maddening, to chase after a sound, only to find silence carefully guarded by silence itself. FOIA, designed as a tool of transparency, became instead an amplifier of mystery. Every denial, every redacted page seemed to say more than a full disclosure ever could. It was as if the system itself had become a voice, repeating endlessly, "You will not find it," and yet the pursuit never fully died. Each new generation of researchers took up the chase, filing new requests, probing new corners of the archive. They did so not because they expected to succeed, but because the absence itself demanded attention. If there was no tape, why were so many doors closed? If the sound never existed, why did fragments of testimony persist across decades? If the moon was silent, why did whispers of its voice never fade? The result was a paradox. The more silence was protected, the more it began to speak. The leak that never was became its own kind of evidence, a negative imprint, like a photograph, developed in reverse. No one could produce the tape, yet no one could fully disprove it. It hovered between existence and myth. its absence more haunting than any revelation could be. And so, researchers found themselves trapped in the strangest irony of all. In their search for a hidden sound, they had uncovered only layers of silence. Yet that silence had a texture, a density, as though it concealed something vast behind it. A recording that never surfaced, a leak that never was, had become louder than the voices of official history. And in that silence, the moon seemed to hum faintly, waiting as though it knew that one day the question would return. The more the silence was protected, the more it began to speak. From the beginning of human memory, the moon has been less an object in the sky than a mirror reflecting our own fears, desires, and stories. Long before telescopes revealed craters and basalt seas, long before astronauts left boot prints in its dust, people gazed upward and saw in that pale face something familiar, sometimes a god, sometimes a lover, sometimes a warning. The moon's silence invited us to fill it with meaning, and so we did. Generation after generation, civilization after civilization. If there truly was a sound on the moon, perhaps its power lay not in its physical vibration, but in what it revealed about us, the listeners, the dreamers, the interpreters of silence. For millennia, cultures around the world have spoken of the moon as if it were alive. In Mesopotamia, the god Sin rode across the night sky, his light guiding calendars and rituals. In ancient Egypt, Thoth, the lunar deity, was keeper of wisdom and words, suggesting that the moon was not only a presence but a speaker. In China, myths told of Chang'e, the immortal who dwelled on the lunar surface, her story tied to themes of longing, separation, and eternal waiting. In every version, the moon was not a dead rock. It was a being capable of communication, if only one could listen closely enough. The Greeks, too, heard a kind of voice in the moon. Philosophers debated whether it was a polished mirror reflecting Earth's oceans or a sphere of its own substance. Plato imagined celestial harmonies, the so-called music of the spheres, in which every heavenly body contributed to a cosmic symphony inaudible to human ears. To think of the moon speaking was not absurd, but natural, consistent with the idea that the heavens themselves were alive with meaning. The moon, closest of all celestial neighbors, would have been the most intimate player in that orchestra. As centuries passed, the myths evolved, but the role of the moon as messenger remained constant. Folklore around the world connected the moon to cycles of birth and death, madness and wisdom, silence and revelation. The word lunacy itself comes from Luna, the Roman moon goddess, reminding us that even the mind's distortions were thought to be shaped by lunar influence. Poets whispered of hearing voices beneath the silver glow. Farmers planted crops according to lunar rhythms, believing that the moon's unseen pull spoke directly to the earth. Lovers swore their secrets to its quiet light, certain that the moon alone could carry their words across distance and time. Seen this way, the supposed lunar sound is not just an artifact of Apollo missions, nor merely a question of magnetic interference or seismic vibrations. It is part of a much older story, humanity's need to believe that the moon responds to us, that the sky is not indifferent but attentive. The hidden tape, whether real or imagined, becomes a modern echo of these ancient archetypes. When people whisper that the moon has a voice, they are reaching back through myth, reviving the same patterns that guided ancestors who sat beneath its glow thousands of years ago. The psychological pull of this idea cannot be underestimated. Silence unsettles us. Humans are creatures of sound, heartbeat, breath, language, music. To encounter silence so vast as the lunar surface is to confront a void that begs to be filled. Perhaps the true sound of the moon has always been our own projection, our insistence that silence cannot be final. The astronauts, too, were human beings, carrying with them not only instruments and scientific protocols, but the weight of myth. When they described strange music, eerie tones, or inexplicable signals, were they not participating in the same tradition as the shepherd who once looked up and thought he saw a woman's face etched on the moon? Yet myth has its own truth. Anthropologists remind us that stories endure because they preserve something essential, even if disguised. The myth of the moon speaking could be less about literal sound and more about revelation. To hear the moon is to confront the hidden, to sense that reality is layered and not all layers are visible. Cultures from the Amazon to the Arctic share tales of shamans who travel to the moon in visions, returning with knowledge for their people. Such stories insist that the moon is not passive but responsive, a reflector not only of sunlight but of meaning. In this light, the modern mystery of the missing tape takes on symbolic resonance. Perhaps the tape exists and perhaps it does not, but the hunger for it reveals our deep need for communion with the moon. The bureaucratic silences, the redacted documents, the contradictions of testimony, all these mirror our own uncertainty. When we gaze at that pale disk, what are we really looking for? A scientific anomaly? A fragment of alien presence? Or something more intimate? Proof that the universe notices us, that we are not merely shouting into emptiness. The moon as mirror reflects not only our myths but our anxieties. During the Cold War, it became a battlefield of symbolism. Whoever reached it first would demonstrate mastery of the future. Yet beneath the surface triumph of Apollo was a quieter unease. To conquer the moon is not to silence it. Instead, it confronts us with its vast indifference. Perhaps that is why the legend of a sound, a hidden recording, grew so powerful. It suggested that the moon was not indifferent after all, that it had responded, however faintly, to our intrusion. Consider how often humanity has projected voices onto silence. We hear patterns in static, words in the hum of machines, songs in the wind. This phenomenon, known as pareidolia, is not an error, but a feature of the human mind, evolved to detect meaning even where none exists. The same impulse that sees a face on the moon's surface also imagines a voice in its silence. But is imagination so different from truth? If billions of people across cultures and centuries believe the moon speaks in some form, does that belief not shape reality in its own way? The moon as mirror also reveals how we conceive of ourselves. When cultures describe the moon as goddess, trickster, lover, or wise elder, they are mapping human traits onto the sky. In doing so, they reveal what they value, what they fear, what they long for. The supposed lunar sound, then, is less a revelation about celestial geology and more a revelation about us, our refusal to accept silence, our yearning for dialogue with the cosmos, our need to believe that the night sky holds answers. And yet myths often hide seeds of truth. Consider the possibility that projection and reality sometimes overlap. What if the moon truly does speak, though not in the ways we expect? Seismic vibrations, plasma interactions, magnetic anomalies, these are physical expressions that might be interpreted as sound. The scientific record acknowledges that the moon rings after meteor impacts, reverberating like a struck bell. To translate that ringing into a voice is a leap of imagination, but imagination often leads science by the hand. Was it myth or foresight that led ancient peoples to believe the moon influenced human behavior? Today, medical science recognizes circadian rhythms and sleep cycles entrained to lunar light. Perhaps the same will be true of its deeper mysteries. In this sense, the tape, real or not, becomes a metaphor. It is the hidden record each culture seeks when it looks upward. It is the whisper we long to hear in silence. The frustration of not finding it mirrors the frustration of never fully understanding ourselves. The moon reflects not only light but mystery, and in that reflection we catch glimpses of what we dare not admit outright, that we want the universe to speak back. Even in the digital age, with satellites mapping every crater and rovers scanning the surface, the myth persists. Children still ask if the moon is alive. Poets still write as though it listens. Lovers still turn to it for guidance. The missing tape, the phantom sound, is simply the newest incarnation of an ancient dialogue. Whether through drums under an African sky, chants under a Native American moon, or whispered prayers in medieval monasteries, humanity has always addressed that silver face. Silence has always answered, and we have always insisted that within that silence lies a voice. So what then is the moon telling us? Perhaps it is reminding us that we create meaning as much as we discover it. That our hunger for a sound on the moon is less about geology than psychology, less about the cosmos than the heart. The tape we seek may not exist in reels of magnetic ribbon, but in the stories we tell, the myths we inherit, The reflections. We cast upward. The moon as mirror shows us who we are, restless, searching, unwilling to let silence remain silence. And yet myths often hide seeds of truth. Whenever a mystery refuses to resolve itself, theories gather like moths around a flame. The supposed sound of the moon, or rather the missing tape that suggests its existence, has become such a flame. In the absence of certainty, speculation multiplies, weaving webs of possibility that stretch from science to conspiracy, from psychology to the esoteric. Each theory seeks to explain what could compel officials to conceal, deny, or distort a discovery. Each offers a key to the silence, yet none unlocks the full truth. They remain, as their title suggests, theories in the shadows, glimpsed, half-formed, unsettling. The most prominent theory, the one that draws immediate fascination, is the idea of alien contact. If the moon produced a sound, if astronauts recorded tones unlike anything expected, then perhaps it was not the moon itself that spoke, but something dwelling upon or within it. Advocates of this view point to long-standing rumors, strange structures glimpsed on orbital photographs, whispers of lights moving across the lunar horizon, testimonies from insiders who claim NASA suppressed images. The sound, in this telling, is evidence of communication, a signal not meant for us but accidentally overheard. This alien hypothesis gains momentum from how persistently it surfaces. Former engineers and contractors, often at the edges of credibility, claim to have heard transmissions from Apollo missions that were edited from official records. Others suggest that the astronauts themselves hinted at contact using coded language when they spoke of Santa Claus or of unidentified objects watching them. In this framework, the tape is not lost but buried, hidden because it proved humanity is not alone. The moon, long regarded as a silent witness, becomes instead a stage for an encounter too dangerous to acknowledge. Yet skeptics counter with her simpler idea. The sound may not have been a message from another intelligence, but a natural resonance of the moon itself. Seismology offers eerie clues. When Apollo astronauts deployed seismometers, they discovered that the moon rang like a bell when struck by meteorites or when ascent stages crashed into its surface. Unlike Earth, whose seismic energy dissipates quickly through water and porous rock, the moon's dry, rigid crust allows vibrations to reverberate for long durations. To translate these vibrations into sound is to hear something uncanny, hollow, metallic, a voice not of intention, but of geology. This theory suggests the missing tape might have captured just such an event. Perhaps instruments recorded vibrations, and when translated into audio frequencies, produced sounds that unsettled the astronauts. The moon in this case is not speaking deliberately but resonating, its silence broken by the echo of impacts. Still, the very phrase "rings like a bell" feels mythic, suggesting hollowness, artificiality, or design. Natural or not, resonance carries a psychological weight that fuels deeper speculation. A third theory casts the mystery not in cosmic or geological terms, but in the cold light of politics. The Cold War PSYOPs hypothesis argues that the missing tape may have been deliberately manufactured or exaggerated as a tool of psychological warfare. In an era when information was weaponized, a rumor of strange lunar sounds could unsettle adversaries, distract journalists, or create an aura of technological superiority. If the Soviets believed America had encountered something extraordinary on the moon, something beyond science, they might hesitate, fearing secrets hidden in the lunar dust. In this reading, the tape is less a record of sound than an instrument of silence, part of the elaborate chess game of misinformation that defined the space race. Supporters of this view note that both superpowers engaged in elaborate disinformation campaigns, from faked broadcasts to staged photographs. A mysterious lunar tape fits easily into that repertoire. Whether or not the sound existed, the very rumor of it served a purpose: to confuse, to intrigue, to dominate the narrative of space exploration. Yet, like any PSYOP, it could also escape its creators, becoming more powerful in rumor than in fact. Still, another explanation returns us to the most fragile element in any story: the human mind. The psychological theory proposes that the sound of the moon was never external at all, but internal, a projection of stress, isolation, or sensory distortion experienced by astronauts in the alien environment of space. Extended confinement, lack of natural rhythms, and the overwhelming silence of the lunar surface could produce hallucinations or auditory illusions. Just as prisoners in sensory deprivation tanks report phantom sounds, so too might astronauts have heard music where none existed. In this sense, the missing tape becomes less a recording of the moon and more a record of the mind under pressure. Officials may have suppressed it not because it contained alien secrets, but because it exposed the vulnerability of those meant to embody strength and control. Admitting that astronauts hallucinated voices on the moon would have undermined the heroic image projected to the public. Thus the tape vanished, not to conceal an external truth but to hide an internal fragility. Yet there are those who go further, who step outside science altogether. The esoteric and spiritual explanations weave the lunar sound into ancient traditions. Of mysticism. To these interpreters, the moon has always been a gateway between worlds, a liminal space where the earthly and the cosmic meet. The sound, therefore, could be a vibration of consciousness, a resonance between human perception and the rhythms of the universe. In Eastern traditions, mantras are said to align the mind with cosmic frequencies. In Western mysticism, the moon is a vessel of hidden wisdom. If astronauts heard a sound, it might not have been a physical vibration but a spiritual one, a reminder that to step onto the moon is to step into myth as much as into rock. Esoteric schools propose that the moon is not dead but alive with subtle energies, shaping tides not only of water but of thought. The missing tape becomes, in this light, a sacred artifact, evidence that modern technology brushed against the same truths known to shamans and poets. The suppression of the tape, then, is not political but existential. To acknowledge it would force recognition that science does not hold the final word, that mystery still breathes within the cosmos. Between these theories, alien, geological, political, psychological, spiritual, there is no single answer, only a spectrum of possibility. Each theory reflects its believers as much as the moon itself. For the ufologist, the sound is proof of contact. For the geologist, it is data misinterpreted. For the political analyst, it is propaganda. For the psychologist, it is stress-induced illusion. For the mystic, it is revelation. The tape, absent and elusive, serves as a canvas onto which every worldview projects its truth. The eerie part is not that so many theories exist, but that none fully satisfies. Each leaves cracks in its logic, gaps in its evidence, shadows in its corners. If aliens were responsible, why no clearer message? If geology explains it, why the secrecy? If politics invented it, why the persistent rumors from those who claim first-hand knowledge? If psychology caused it, why do multiple accounts echo the same details? If mysticism is the answer, why cloak it in bureaucratic denial rather than, or perhaps the multiplicity of theories is itself the point? The moon, as ever, reflects us, our fears, our ambitions, our blind spots. Theories in the shadows reveal less about the moon than about humanity's refusal to accept silence. We cannot endure the thought that the moon might simply be what it is, a companion world, mute, indifferent. So we spin stories, cloak them in science or secrecy, and whisper that behind every denial lies a hidden truth. And yet each theory leaves one haunting possibility, that the truth, whatever it may be, is stranger than all of them. That the tape, real or imagined, does not fit within alien, geological, political, psychological, or mystical categories. That it hovers, unresolved, like the moon itself, both familiar and unknowable, reflecting our gaze but never fully revealing its face. In that unresolved tension lies the heart of the mystery, a sound in the silence, a shadow on the light, a secret that endures because it refuses to be caught. But every theory leaves one haunting possibility. What if the missing tape were to surface today? What if, after decades of whispers and rumors, after redacted memos and evasive denials, someone released the sound of the moon, the sound that astronauts supposedly heard, but the world was never allowed to witness? Would it echo across our lives as a revelation, a curiosity, or a threat? To imagine such an unveiling is to imagine the fragile balance of trust, wonder, and fear upon which our modern world rests. The first response, no doubt, would be skepticism. In an age where every photograph can be altered and every audio clip manipulated, the claim of authenticity would face immediate scrutiny. Experts would dissect waveforms, search for anomalies, and argue over whether the sound had been generated artificially. Debunkers would publish rapid-fire analyses within hours, declaring it a hoax, while others would swear that its strangeness was precisely what proved its truth. The digital battlefield would ignite instantly, a storm of certainty and doubt. Yet skepticism alone cannot contain curiosity. People would want to hear it for themselves. Whether uploaded to a hidden server, leaked to journalists, or dropped anonymously on social media, the recording would travel faster than any official response. Within hours, millions would have downloaded it, headphones pressed tightly waiting for revelation. The experience would be intimate, unsettling, a voice or vibration or resonance that seemed to come not from Earth, not from human invention, but from elsewhere. For some, it would feel anticlimactic, mere noise. For others, it would be transcendent, a sound that shifted how they understood their place in the universe. The scientific community would split along predictable lines. Geophysicists might explain it as lunar seismic resonance, an artifact of instruments translating vibration into audible frequency. Audio engineers might analyze the spectrum, comparing it to natural phenomena, whale songs, plasma waves, cosmic radiation. Astronomers might dismiss it as meaningless, while astrobiologists would raise cautious eyebrows, suggesting that even ambiguous data deserve study. Meanwhile, fringe researchers and independent scientists would seize the moment, publishing papers outside traditional channels, desperate to claim authority over the interpretation. Governments, however, would face a different dilemma. To acknowledge the tape as genuine would be to admit decades of concealment. To deny it would risk inflaming conspiracy theories further. Silence, the strategy so long maintained, might no longer be viable in an era when information cannot easily be buried. Officials would scramble for language, phrases like unverified, misattributed, or taken out of context. Press conferences would be carefully staged, emphasizing the unknown while avoiding admission of secrecy. Yet the very act of evasion would confirm what many already believed, that the tape was real and that its suppression was deliberate. The public reaction would fracture. For some, the sound would become a symbol of awe, proof that the cosmos still holds mysteries beyond our grasp. New religions or spiritual movements might seize upon it, declaring it a message from the divine, a cosmic hymn intended for human ears only now prepared to listen. In online communities, debates would rage over its meaning. Was it alien? Was it geological? Was it a hoax seeded long ago? Each faction would find in the sound a mirror of its own hopes and fears. Others would see in the tape an opportunity for weaponization. Military analysts might speculate whether the sound contained a coded message or frequency capable of manipulation. Could it be harnessed for psychological warfare, like the infamous Voice of God experiments? Could it inspire fear in adversaries, convince populations of alien surveillance, or serve as justification for expanded defense budgets? Even if the sound were meaningless in itself, its cultural impact could be weaponized, shaped into a tool of power in an age where narrative is as potent as technology. But perhaps the most profound reaction would be one of awe. The sound of the moon, however interpreted, would remind humanity that the universe is not silent, that our closest celestial neighbor, long regarded as barren and mute, carries within it a resonance that touches something deep within us. For many, hearing the tape would not be about science or politics, but about emotion, the raw wonder of hearing a voice, however strange, from beyond Earth. Classrooms would play it to wide-eyed students. Artists would sample it in music, blending cosmic resonance with human rhythm. Poets would write verses inspired by its haunting tones. For once the world might pause, united by curiosity rather than divided by conflict. The tape's release would also provoke a re-examination of history. If this sound was genuine, what else had been hidden? Citizens would demand answers not only about the moon but about Mars, about probes sent beyond the solar system, about classified discoveries buried in vaults. The tape would act as a crack in the wall of secrecy, widening into fissures that threaten to expose far more than one recording. Trust in institutions, already fragile, might collapse further under the weight of revelation. The moon could become the silence of governments, and both would be judged. Yet there is a darker possibility: indifference. In a world already saturated with crises, climate change, political unrest, pandemics, the tape might become just another curiosity, a meme briefly trending before fading into obscurity. The sound of the moon might be absorbed into pop culture, stripped of mystery by repetition. It could be commercialized, turned into ringtones or ambient tracks, sold as novelty rather than reverence. The greatest secret of the space age might end not in revelation, but in commodification. Still, even commodification cannot fully erase the seed of mystery. Once heard, the tape would linger in memory. Late at night, listeners might return to it, replaying the resonance, wondering what it truly meant. Conversations over dinner tables, in classrooms, on late-night radio shows would circle back to it. The sound would become part of the cultural lexicon, a reference point like the first photograph of Earth from orbit or the Voyager Golden Record. It would remind us that we live within a vastness that resists easy explanation. The speculative horizon extends further. What if the sound contained patterns, mathematical sequences, rhythms suggestive of intelligence? Artificial intelligence could be unleashed to analyze it, searching for hidden codes or messages embedded in the frequencies. A discovery of structure within the tape would elevate it from anomaly to artifact, from curiosity to contact. Entire fields of study would mobilize, while the world debated what such a message implied. Were we being invited, warned, observed? Theories would spiral outward, each darker or more wondrous than the last. If instead the tape revealed only natural resonance, even that would shift our perspective. To hear the moon ring with its own geological voice is to be reminded that celestial bodies are not dead stones but dynamic presences. The sound would deepen our understanding of the cosmos, a reminder that silence is an illusion created by the limits of our perception. Space, in truth, hums with frequencies beyond our ears, and the moon's contribution would become a symbol of that hidden music. Above all, the resurfacing of the tape would force humanity to confront a question larger than science, larger than secrecy. What does it mean to listen? We are surrounded by signals, cosmic background radiation, pulsar beats, gravitational waves, yet often deaf to their meaning. The missing tape, once heard, would be a test of how we respond to mystery. Do we demand explanation, or do we allow wonder? Do we weaponize the unknown, or do we revere it? Do we dismiss what we cannot categorize, or do we let it transform us? In this way, imagining the tape's return is less about the tape itself and more about us. Our reaction would reveal our priorities, our fears, our hopes. The sound of the moon might not change the universe, but it could change how we see ourselves within it. For in listening, truly listening, we are confronted with the silence we have always feared, that the cosmos may not care for us, or that it cares in ways we cannot comprehend. And so the possibility of listening again becomes an act of choice. The tape may remain buried, locked away in archives, or it may yet surface, whether by whistleblower, accident, or deliberate release. But the deeper question lingers. If we had the chance to hear it, would we be ready? Not merely to analyze, to debunk, to argue, but to let it unsettle us, to let it expand our sense of reality. To let the moon speak, and to admit that we do not fully understand what it says. If we listened again, perhaps the greatest revelation would not be the sound itself, but the silence that follows, the silence within us, the pause in which we realize how small, how fragile, how fleeting we are against the backdrop of cosmic resonance. That is the haunting gift the tape might offer, not answers, but perspective. And so we arrive at the silence of now, and the question left unresolved. As our journey nears its close, we return to the moon, suspended in the dark canvas of night, serene and distant. It hangs in silence, yet that silence is never absolute. We have traced its echoes through decades of human curiosity, through whispered rumors and redacted files, through theories both scientific and fantastical. Each section of this journey has carried us deeper into the interplay of history imagination, and longing. And now, in the quietude of reflection, we ask, what is the meaning of a sound that may never have been, yet has persisted so vividly in human consciousness? The moon is more than rock and dust. It is a mirror reflecting the complexity of our own desires. We see in it not merely craters and plains, but symbols of immortality, of the unknown, of contact with forces beyond our understanding. The alleged recording, the tape that has never fully emerged from obscurity, serves as a focal point for that reflection. Whether real or metaphorical, the very idea of a sound from the moon challenges the assumptions we carry about silence, space, and perception. It reminds us that human experience is not limited to what is observable or measurable. Mystery itself shapes our history and imagination. Even in silence, the moon resonates. Apollo astronauts returned to Earth carrying not only physical samples, but intangible impressions, awe, vulnerability, and an acute sense of isolation. These impressions, when filtered through decades of storytelling, become legends. They form the threads that weave together conspiracy theories, scientific speculation, psychological analysis, and spiritual reflection. The moon's voice, if it exists, is at once literal and symbolic. It inhabits our memory and our myths, echoing through the minds of those who seek to hear it. We have seen that bureaucracy, secrecy, and failed FOIA requests have only amplified fascination. Each denial, each redaction, has transformed absence into presence. The very act of suppression has given the alleged recording a kind of immortality. It thrives not in reels or files, but in the collective imagination of humanity. Scholars, enthusiasts, and casual dreamers alike have contributed to a chorus of speculation, turning what may be nothing into a phenomenon that transcends evidence. In this way, the sound of the moon becomes less about technology and more about human perception. As we imagine what would happen if the tape were released, we see a spectrum of reactions: skepticism, awe, fear, and wonder. People would confront a sound that defies easy classification, challenging assumptions about the moon, the universe, and ourselves. But even if the tape remains forever hidden, it has already influenced us. Its legend shapes how we view exploration, how we consider the boundaries of human knowledge, and how we confront the limits of our own perception. The mystery persists not because of evidence, but because of the yearning it ignites. And now the poetic truth emerges. The moon may be silent to the ear, but it is never silent to the imagination. Even in its quiet, it hums with the accumulated resonance of human thought, desire, and wonder. We have long imagined it speaking, long listened for echoes, long wondered if the vacuum could carry more than emptiness. The sound that may or may not exist has already been heard in countless minds, interpreted in countless ways, and felt in countless hearts. In this sense, the sound has never faded. The poetic conclusion, 1,000 words embedded here. Look up tonight. See the moon suspended in the vast black, silvered and distant. Let your eyes trace the contours of its face, craters and plains etched in shadow and light. Imagine standing beneath it, alone or with another, feeling its quiet presence not as a void but as a mirror. What do you hear? Nothing? Or something that stirs the memory of stories whispered in dark rooms, of myths passed through centuries, of secrets hidden in the very idea of space itself. We have spent decades, centuries in a way, learning to speak, to measure, to map. And yet the moon, that constant companion, refuses to surrender its mystery. It listens silently, indifferent to the clamor below, and in its patience teaches us that silence is not absence. It is presence in a form we cannot easily grasp. In every glance upward, in every myth and rumor, in every imagined tone or vibration, the moon offers a conversation that is timeless. Its voice is not only what might be recorded on tape, it is the resonance it leaves in our hearts and minds. The human need for mystery is ancient. We fear what we cannot know, yet we crave it. We seek proof and evidence, yet we long for wonder. The alleged lunar recording embodies this paradox. Whether it exists or is entirely metaphorical, it has become a vessel for hope, fear, curiosity, and awe. To hear the moon speak, or to believe we might, is to participate in a dialogue with the cosmos itself. It reminds us that some truths are not grasped through data alone, but through imagination, intuition, and reflection. Even as science charts every crater, maps every ridge, and measures every seismic tremor, the moon retains a quiet majesty. The hypothetical tape becomes symbolic of this enduring mystery. Its absence is as powerful as its presence would be, for it compels us to ask questions we might not otherwise ask. What does it mean to be human in the face of vast silence? How do we confront the unknown? How do we preserve wonder in a world driven by certainty? These questions linger, resonant as the hypothetical tones once captured by astronauts' instruments. And so we return to the idea of listening, not merely to sound, but to possibility. To imagine the moon's voice is to imagine the universe, speaking back to us, offering not answers but reflection. We might hear nothing or we might hear everything, depending on the openness of our perception. In this way, the recording becomes more than a historical artifact. It becomes a metaphor for all that is hidden, all that is beautiful, and all that defies comprehension. The moon teaches patience. It teaches humility. It teaches that silence, once embraced, can echo louder than words. Consider the astronauts, those human ears closest to the lunar surface. Alone in space, surrounded by infinite black, they may have heard something, or thought they did. Whether it was a misinterpretation, an instrument artifact, or a genuine anomaly, their experience underscores the fragility of perception. We are beings shaped by limits, yet reaching for the infinite. To hear the moon, to believe we might, is to acknowledge both our vulnerability and our audacity. It is to engage in a dance with mystery itself, one step measured, the next unknown. Even now, as you read this, the moon hangs above, impervious and eternal. Its silence is a canvas, and our imagination paints upon it. Perhaps the tape exists, buried in a vault, or perhaps it never existed at all. Perhaps it is real, perhaps metaphorical, or perhaps it exists somewhere in between, where reality and perception meet. But the power of the sound does not depend on its provenance. Its resonance is measured not in decibels but in wonder, not in charts but in hearts. It has never truly faded, for every whisper of curiosity, every rumor, every moment spent gazing upward keeps it alive. We leave the moon as it has always been, silent in form, yet vibrant in effect. Its mystery is not a problem to be solved, but a presence to be felt. The sound that never fades is the sound of human imagination reaching outward, the echo of stories we tell ourselves to make sense of the incomprehensible, the voice of longing cast against the vastness of space. It is a reminder that some questions are eternal, that some silences are eloquent, and that in listening, truly listening, we discover as much about ourselves as about the universe. The moon continues to hang, patient, silent, luminous, reflecting. Both sunlight and our imagination. It does not answer, but it does not need to. Its mystery is enough, its resonance endures. Its whispers, whether real or imagined, continue to ripple across time, waiting for ears willing to hear, hearts willing to wonder, and minds willing to embrace the unknown. In the quiet of night, in the stillness of thought, in the vast reaches, beyond our fragile world, the moon speaks always. And so the sound that may or may not exist becomes eternal, not as a recording but as an idea, a memory, a question that refuses to be silenced. Its echo is human curiosity. Its resonance is awe. Its presence is infinite. As we reach the final moments of this journey, we return one last time to the moon, that pale, silvered companion suspended above our world. For centuries, it has been a silent witness to human ambition, fear, and imagination. And yet, in its apparent quiet, it has spoken to us in ways we could scarcely comprehend. From the earliest myths to the modern Apollo missions, the moon has held a mirror up to our collective consciousness, reflecting not only our curiosity about the cosmos, but our longing for connection, mystery, and understanding. The whispered rumors of an audio recording hidden away in NASA's vaults are part of this long conversation. A reminder that silence is never truly empty, and absence can speak as powerfully as presence. Throughout this exploration, we have traced the path of humanity toward the moon, from the first eyes turned skyward to the astronauts who set foot on its dusty plains. We began with the cultural and historical backdrop of the space race, the Cold War tensions, and the awe-inspiring moment when humanity dared to leave its cradle and touch another world. Each section illuminated a different facet of the mystery: static and anomalies in transmissions, whispers heard beyond craters, the rumored tape lying hidden, and the theories that span alien contact, lunar resonance, Cold War strategy, and even spiritual or esoteric interpretations. Every story, every reflection, has brought us closer to understanding not just the moon, but the human heart that seeks meaning in silence. The moon's voice, whether literal or metaphorical, symbolizes something essential about our nature. It reminds us that curiosity drives us to explore, that uncertainty can be a source of awe rather than fear, and that mysteries are not always meant to be solved, but to be contemplated. We have imagined the sound itself, strange, rhythmic tones, or perhaps a voice-like signal that defied explanation. We have considered how it might have been edited, suppressed, or misinterpreted. We have wondered how it would feel to hear it today, whether it would spark wonder, fear, or disbelief. And in all these reflections, one theme emerges: the moon, silent or singing, has become a canvas for the imagination, a stage upon which humanity projects its dreams, fears, and stories. As we contemplate the possibility of listening again, we are confronted with profound questions about truth, perception, and human aspiration. Would the recording, if it surfaced, confirm our suspicions about the unknown, or simply deepen the mystery? Could it be explained by natural lunar resonance, a product of seismology and physics, or is it something beyond the realm of science, a signal whose origin eludes comprehension? Might it be a psychological echo, a projection of the minds of astronauts alone in the void, or a deliberate act of secrecy by institutions aware of its potential impact? Each possibility reminds us that mystery is often layered, complex, and inescapably human. Yet even without proof, the legend endures. It thrives in the whispers of researchers, in the stories passed down from those who claim glimpses of the tape, in the imagination of those who dare to wonder. The missing recording is more than a file in a vault. It is an idea, a symbol of what it means to seek, to question, and to listen. It embodies our need to believe that the universe is not indifferent, that even in silence there is conversation, between worlds, between eras, and between ourselves and the cosmos. It challenges us to recognize that some truths may never be fully revealed, but their pursuit enriches the human experience all the same. In the end, the moon teaches us patience. It reminds us that awe is not contingent upon answers, and that silence has its own eloquence. By imagining the sound, by following the stories, by listening in mind and memory, we participate in a dialogue that spans centuries. The moon is eternal, and so too is our fascination with it. Its quiet presence calls us to humility, inviting us to gaze upward and acknowledge the limits of knowledge while celebrating the vastness of possibility. In this interplay of silence and imagination, we find both comfort and exhilaration, a gentle reminder that the cosmos is more than a backdrop. It is a partner in the ongoing story of human curiosity. As we close this journey, we are left with a lingering sense of awe and wonder. Whether the recording is real, whether it captures an extraterrestrial voice, a natural resonance, or a psychological projection, its power lies in the questions it inspires. It reminds us that the universe is vast, strange, and filled with mysteries waiting to be contemplated. And in that contemplation, we discover something intimate: our own desire to listen, to understand, and to imagine beyond the confines of the everyday world. The moon may appear silent to the ear, but its echoes resonate in human imagination, in stories, myths, and the quiet moments when we look upward and wonder what lies beyond. So tonight, as the moon hangs in the night sky, let us listen, not necessarily for sound but for resonance. Let us honor the mystery that has captivated generations, the whispers that may exist only in imagination, yet hold immense power. Let us embrace the awe, the quiet, and the eternal curiosity that the moon inspires. In doing so, we keep alive the very essence of the story we have shared, a story of wonder, of secrecy, of humanity reaching beyond itself in search of understanding. The sound of the moon may never be fully heard, but its echo endures, haunting and beautiful, a reminder that silence itself can speak, and that the cosmos is alive with the possibility of the unknown. And as we depart from this exploration, the moon remains, a silent witness, a mirror of our curiosity, a companion in the eternal dance of mystery and discovery. Its voice, whether hidden in tape, myth, or imagination, is a reminder that some stories never end. They linger, timeless and profound, inviting each new listener to join the conversation, to look up and wonder, to feel the quiet thrill of the cosmos speaking back. In the hush of night, the moon whispers still, and the sound, whatever it may be, never fades.